Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I don't usually share personal stuff online, but I need to get this off my chest. What happened that night in May 2020 still keeps me up sometimes. I've told a couple close friends, but they just laugh it off or look at me like I'm crazy. Maybe I am, but I know what I saw. We'd been living outside Andalusia, Alabama for about 7 years by then. Nice piece of land, about 3 acres, backed up against some woods. Good place to raise kids, you know? Quiet, peaceful. We'd been saving up to add on to the house. Nothing fancy, just a proper laundry room and a 2-car garage, so we wouldn't have to park outside anymore. Construction started in February, but then COVID hit and everything slowed down. The crew would come when they could, but by May it was this half-finished shell attached to our house. It happened on a Tuesday. I remember because I'd taken the kids to my in-laws that morning, and my wife Karen was working a double shift at the hospital. She's a nurse, and things were crazy busy back then with the pandemic. I spent the day running errands, grocery store, hardware store, picking up stuff we needed. Nothing special. I got home around 7:30 in the evening. The sun was just starting to go down, that golden hour light making everything look peaceful. I pulled into our gravel driveway, parked near the back of the house where we usually do since the construction mess was everywhere. The first thing I noticed was lights on in the addition. Not bright lights, just that dim glow of those temporary construction lights they'd strung up. I distinctly remember thinking it was weird because the workers had left days ago, and I knew I'd turned everything off. I figured maybe an electrician had stopped by. The foreman had mentioned someone might come to check the wiring that week. So I grabbed my grocery bags from the trunk and headed toward the back door, which meant walking past the half-finished garage. That's when I saw it. I was about 30 feet away when I noticed something standing next to my SUV. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was a shadow or some equipment the workers had left behind. But then it moved, just slightly, shifting its weight. And I realized I was looking at something alive, something massive. It was standing on the sloped part of our yard, where the ground drops about 3 feet down from where the concrete pad was poured. Even standing on that lower ground, this thing was towering over my Ford Explorer, head and shoulders above it, and my Explorer is a good 6 feet tall. I froze, completely froze. The grocery bags suddenly felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was just this massive, dark silhouette, broader than any person I've ever seen. I'm 6'1", 200 pounds, not a small guy, but this thing made me feel tiny. It was dusk, getting dark fast, and the figure was backlit by those construction lights, so I couldn't make out details. Just this enormous shadow standing upright, human-shaped, but wrong, too big, too still. I could feel it watching me. I know that sounds crazy, but I could feel its eyes on me even though I couldn't see them. I don't know how long we stood there looking at each other, probably only seconds, but it felt like hours. Then I heard this sound, hard to describe, like a deep exhale but louder than any human could make. That broke the spell. I dropped the groceries and ran. Straight into the house, locked the door behind me, hands shaking so bad I could barely turn the key. I grabbed my shotgun from the gun safe, a Remington 870 I keep for home defense, called my son Nathan, who lives about 10 minutes away. I was trying to sound calm, but he knew something was wrong right away. "Dad, what's going on?" I didn't want to sound crazy. "There's someone on the property, big guy, by the construction site. Can you come over?" He said he'd be right there. Those 10 minutes waiting were the longest of my life. I kept the lights off, peering out the windows, trying to see if it was still there, but the angle wasn't right. I couldn't see the garage area from inside. When Nathan pulled up, I met him at the front door with the shotgun. "Jesus, Dad, what's happening?" he asked, eyeing the gun. I tried to explain what I'd seen while keeping an eye on the tree line. Someone was standing by the Explorer. Biggest person I've ever seen. Way too big to be normal. Nathan looked skeptical but took it seriously. He grabbed a flashlight from his truck and I handed him the baseball bat from behind the door. We decided to circle the property, making noise as we went, figuring if it was some trespasser, they'd take off. We walked the perimeter, shouting things like, "Police have been called," and "We're armed." Nathan was scanning the woods with his flashlight, but we didn't see anything unusual. No movement, no sounds, except for normal night critters. After about 20 minutes of this, we headed back toward the construction area. I was starting to feel ridiculous. Maybe it had been a shadow, or maybe I was more tired than I realized. But then we got to where my Explorer was parked, and Nathan's flashlight swept across the ground. "Dad," he said, his voice different, "look at this." The beam of light was highlighting the concrete pad they'd poured for the garage floor. It had rained earlier that day, so the concrete was damp, showing every mark clearly. And there they were, footprints, but not normal footprints. These were barefoot prints, with 5 toes clearly visible, but they were enormous. I wear a size 12 shoe, and these were easily half again as large. The stride between them was incredible too, like 4 or 5 feet apart. No normal person steps like that. I keep a pair of Shaquille O'Neal sneakers as a collector's item in my office, size 22. Got them at a charity auction years ago. These prints were bigger than those shoes. Much bigger. Nathan and I just stood there staring at those prints. They crossed the concrete pad and then disappeared into the soft earth beyond, heading toward the woods. "What the hell, Dad?" Nathan whispered. "Those aren't human." I didn't know what to say. The creature I'd seen earlier suddenly didn't seem like a trick of the light anymore. Whatever had made those prints was real and massive. We followed the tracks as far as we could, but once they hit the tree line, they became harder to see in the leaf litter and underbrush. The trail seemed to head straight into the densest part of the woods behind our property. We decided to head back to the house and lock everything up tight. I called the sheriff's department, but I didn't mention the size of the prints or the creature. Just said I'd spotted a trespasser on my property. They said they'd send someone out in the morning to take a report. Nathan stayed over that night. Neither of us slept much. We kept taking turns checking the windows, listening for any unusual sounds. But the night remained quiet. In the morning, we went back out to look at the prints again, but it had rained heavily overnight. The concrete had been washed clean, and any tracks in the dirt were ruined. When the deputy showed up, there was nothing to show him. I could tell he thought it was just another paranoid homeowner worried about some teenager cutting across his property. After he left, Nathan and I measured the height of my Explorer, just over 6 feet. Whatever I saw had been standing on ground about 3 feet lower than the vehicle, yet still towered over it. That meant this thing had to be at least 9 feet tall, possibly taller. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was someone on stilts playing a prank. But who could move that silently, disappear so completely, and leave bare footprints? Maybe it was some basketball player with gigantism who decided to trespass barefoot in rural Alabama during a pandemic. That didn't make sense either. I joked to Nathan, maybe I saw a Sasquatch, and we both laughed nervously, but the laugh died in my throat. Because deep down, that's exactly what I was thinking. For weeks afterward, I kept the shotgun close. I installed motion sensor lights all around the property. Karen thought I was overreacting to a prowler, but she humored me. I didn't tell her exactly what I'd seen, just said someone had been snooping around the construction site. About a month later, I was at the hardware store in town when I overheard 2 guys talking. One was telling the other about his cousin who worked at Fort Rucker, the army base, about 30 miles from us. Apparently, some soldiers on a night training exercise had reported seeing an unusually large bipedal figure near the base perimeter. The military had written it off as fatigue and poor visibility, but several men had seen it. I nearly dropped the paint cans I was holding. This wasn't just me. Other people had seen something too. I've spent countless hours researching since then. Turns out, the woods of Alabama have a long history of Bigfoot sightings. Most happen deeper in the forests, not in semi-rural areas like ours. But with the pandemic, with everyone locked down and staying home, maybe these creatures got bolder. Maybe they started exploring places they normally wouldn't go. I still don't know what to believe. I've never been the type to buy into conspiracy theories or supernatural stuff. I'm a practical guy. I work in insurance, for God's sake. But I know what I saw that night. I know what those footprints looked like. And I know that whatever it wasn't human. The construction eventually finished, but I've never felt completely comfortable in the new garage. Sometimes I'll be putting tools away or working on my car, and I'll get this feeling of being watched. I'll look up at the woods beyond our property line and wonder if it's out there watching me. Karen thinks I need therapy. Maybe she's right. But therapy won't erase what I saw. It won't explain those massive footprints. It won't tell me why this creature came onto our property, stood by my vehicle, and then vanished without a trace. The weirdest part is that it never felt threatening, terrifying, yes, because of its sheer size. But it didn't make any aggressive moves. It was just looking, observing. Like it was curious about the construction, about us, about our human world. I never filed an official report about what I actually saw. Who would believe me? But I know what happened that night in May 2020. I know what stood in my backyard, towering over my SUV. I know what left those massive footprints with 5 distinct toes. I just don't know what it was, or if it'll ever come back. Sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I'll stand at the window looking out at those woods, and I swear sometimes I can feel something looking back. Story 2. I've never really talked about this with many people. For years, I convinced myself it was just my imagination, or maybe some kind of wild animal that looked different through the filter of fear. But now I'm not so sure, and I need to put this down somewhere, even if just to make sense of it myself. This happened back in July 1995. I was a private in the Army stationed at Fort Polk in western Louisiana. Anyone who's done time at Polk knows it's basically a never-ending sauna surrounded by dense forest and swampland. I was working with the aviation unit there, primarily on helicopter exercises, but had a few days of downtime that week. I've always been fascinated by Native American history, and I'd spend my free time looking for arrowheads or pottery fragments around the base. Nothing serious, just a hobby to get me out in nature and away from the barracks. Fort Polk and the surrounding area has a rich history of indigenous settlements, so it wasn't uncommon to stumble across the occasional artifact if you knew where to look. That morning started like any other. I woke up around 5:30, had a quick breakfast at the mess hall and headed out. The sun was just starting to break through the trees, and there was that heavy morning mist hanging over everything. If you've spent time in Louisiana, you know the kind of humidity I'm talking about. The air so thick you feel like you're breathing through a wet towel. I'd heard from one of the older NCOs that there were some promising spots to check out about 1.5 miles northeast of the main base, along the edge of a restricted impact zone. These impact zones were areas where they'd conduct artillery training, so they were off-limits. But the borders sometimes had undisturbed areas where you could find stuff. I walked along this paved access road for about 1.5 miles. It was quiet that morning, just the sound of cicadas and the occasional bird call. The base was conducting minimal operations that week, so there weren't many vehicles around. When I reached the spot where the NCO had suggested I check, I turned north onto this narrow dirt trail that cut through some pretty dense woods. The trail wasn't much, probably made by local hunters or maybe other soldiers with the same hobby as me. It was overgrown in spots, with vines and brambles grabbing at my pants as I pushed through. The forest here was old growth, towering pines mixed with oak and cypress, with that thick undergrowth that's typical of Louisiana woodlands. The canopy was so dense in spots that it was almost like twilight on the forest floor, despite being mid-morning by this point. After about 3/4 of a mile, the trail started to descend slightly, and I could hear the sound of running water ahead. There was supposed to be a small creek in the area, and creek beds are often good spots to find arrowheads or other artifacts that might have been exposed by water erosion. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was maybe a deer or wild hog moving through the underbrush. There was a heavy rustling sound coming from about 150 feet into the woods to my right. But then came this deep, guttural grunt that stopped me dead in my tracks. It wasn't like any animal sound I was familiar with, not a hog or a bear or anything I'd ever heard around those woods. It was deep, powerful, deliberate. I froze completely. Every instinct in my body suddenly went on high alert. You know that feeling when your body reacts before your mind has even processed what's happening? My skin literally crawled with goosebumps despite the July heat, and I felt this wave of cold wash over me. Then came the strangest sensation, this overwhelming feeling of being watched, not just observed, but intensely scrutinized. I'd experienced something similar during training exercises when we knew snipers were positioned in the area. That sixth sense that tells you eyes are on you. But this was far more intense. After what felt like forever, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds, there was a second grunt, lower, almost like a warning, and then movement. I'll never forget what I saw next. From the direction of the creek, about 150 feet away, a large figure stood up. It had apparently been crouching or kneeling at the creek bank, but now it rose to full height. And it was tall. I'd estimate between 6 and 7 feet, maybe more. It was dark, not just black, but a deep, dark brown that almost blended with the shadows of the forest. And it was unmistakably upright, bipedal, standing on 2 legs. The shape was humanoid, but wrong. The proportions weren't right. The shoulders were too broad, the arms too long. It had this massive barrel chest that tapered to a narrower waist. I couldn't make out facial features clearly at that distance and through the foliage, but I could see its head turn in my direction. For a split second, couldn't have been more than a breath, I felt like we made eye contact. I don't know how to explain it, but in that moment I knew with absolute certainty that whatever this was, it was intelligent. There was an awareness there, a presence of mind that went beyond animal instinct. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and moved away from me, crashing through the underbrush in the opposite direction. The way it moved was both powerful and fluid, not the clumsy gait of a bear on its hind legs or a person in a costume. This thing knew the forest and moved through it with purpose, though not with the silence you might expect. It seemed almost like it wanted me to hear it leaving. I didn't stick around. Every horror movie I'd ever seen flashed through my mind, and my feet were moving before I'd even made a conscious decision to retreat. I practically ran the entire 3/4 of a mile back to the paved road, constantly looking over my shoulder, feeling like at any moment something might emerge from the trees behind me. When I reached the road, I slowed to catch my breath, but I didn't stop moving until I was back within sight of the main base buildings. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and my uniform was soaked through with sweat. The rest of that day is kind of a blur. I remember showering for a long time when I got back to the barracks, trying to process what I'd seen. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear, though I knew bears in that area were extremely rare. Maybe it was someone from the base in ghillie suit doing some kind of unauthorized training exercise. Maybe it was a loose horse from one of the nearby farms. though that explanation fell apart the second I thought about it standing upright. I didn't report it to anyone. What was I going to say? That I saw a monster in the woods? That would have earned me endless ridicule or worse, a psychological evaluation. So I kept it to myself and eventually pushed it to the back of my mind, chalking it up to an overactive imagination or a trick of the light and shadows. For years, I barely thought about the incident. I transferred to different posts, eventually moved to the Army Reserve in Kansas, and that day at Fort Polk became just another vague memory from my early military career. Then, in 2001, 6 years later, everything changed. I was working with a guy named Martinez, who had transferred into our reserve unit after serving as an Army Ranger. We were doing a weekend drill, sitting around one night after training, swapping stories about our active duty days. Someone brought up weird experiences they'd had on base, and people started throwing out tales of strange noises, inexplicable lights, the usual stuff. I don't know what made me bring it up after all those years. Maybe it was the casual atmosphere, or the fact that we were all sharing strange experiences. But I mentioned my encounter in the woods at Fort Polk, keeping my tone light, like it was just another ghost story. Martinez didn't laugh. Instead, he got this serious look on his face and asked me for more details. When I finished, he told me something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. While serving as a Ranger sniper near Fort Lewis in Washington State, he and his spotter had repeatedly observed large bipedal figures through their night vision goggles during training exercises. According to him, these figures would observe their positions from a distance, occasionally communicate through grunts, whistles, or wood knocking, and move with an awareness that suggested intelligence rather than animal behavior. We called them woods people, he told me. Command knew about them but had a clear policy. Don't engage, don't report officially. They're not hostile unless provoked, so we left them alone and they left us alone. Martinez wasn't some conspiracy theorist or attention seeker. He was a professional soldier with multiple deployments under his belt, someone I respected. And he was telling me, in no uncertain terms, that what I'd seen that day at Fort Polk was likely a Sasquatch. After that conversation, memories of that day came flooding back with new clarity. Details I hadn't fully processed at the time suddenly made sense. The unnatural silence in the forest right before the encounter, the strange smell I'd briefly noticed but couldn't identify, something like wet dog mixed with something musky and unfamiliar. The way smaller wildlife had gone completely silent. I started doing research cautiously at first, then with increasing interest. I found accounts from other military personnel who'd had similar experiences on bases across the country: Fort Benning, Fort Bragg, Fort Lewis, and yes, Fort Polk. These massive tracts of land, often undeveloped and with restricted civilian access, apparently make ideal habitats for these creatures. What haunts me most about that day isn't just what I saw, but the feeling that came with it. That sense of being in the presence of something ancient and intelligent, something that knew the forests of Louisiana far better than I ever could. I felt like I was the intruder, not it. I've spent years trying to make sense of what happened that morning at Fort Polk. Was it really a Sasquatch? I can't say with absolute certainty, but I know what I saw wasn't a bear, wasn't a person, and wasn't my imagination. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist according to conventional science, but was nevertheless standing there at that creek bed, as real as the trees and the sky. Sometimes I wonder if it was as startled to see me as I was to see it. If in some remote part of the Louisiana forests, there's a creature that occasionally tells its own kind about the time it encountered a strange, uniformed figure wandering alone through its territory. I've never been back to that specific part of Fort Polk. My military career took me elsewhere, and I eventually left the service altogether. But I still think about that day, about those brief seconds of eye contact across the forest, about the moment when my understanding of the world and what exists in it changed forever. So that's my story. I don't expect everyone to believe it. I'm not sure I would if someone told me the same thing, but it happened just as I've described it. And based on what I've learned since, I don't think my experience is as unique as I once believed. There are things in the forests of America that we don't understand, that exist on the periphery of our world, rarely seen, but very much there. And sometimes, if you're in the right place at the wrong time, you might just catch a glimpse of them. Story 3. I've never told many people about what happened that day. Maybe it's because I'm afraid they wouldn't believe me, or worse, they'd think I was crazy. But I need to get this off my chest, and I figure if anyone would understand, it would be you folks. It was August 24th, 2003. The date is burned into my memory. I was driving back home to Prince George after visiting my sister who lives about an hour away. It was late afternoon, maybe around 5 or so, and the sun was still bright in the sky. You know how beautiful those summer days are in British Columbia. The air was crisp, sky-clear blue, and the forest looked so vibrant and full of life. I'd made that drive probably hundreds of times before. I grew up around Prince George and know those roads like the back of my hand. I was on one of those long stretches where the dense forest lines both sides of the road. There wasn't much traffic that day. I think I'd passed maybe 2 cars in the last 20 minutes. I had the windows down, enjoying the fresh air and listening to some old CD. I think it was Fleetwood Mac. I wasn't speeding or anything, probably going about 80 kilometers per hour. The road curved gently to the right, and as I came around the bend, that's when I first saw them. At first, it was just a glimpse of something dark at the edge of the road. My initial thought was deer. We get so many around here, and you always have to be careful. But something felt different immediately. They weren't shaped right for deer, not for bears either. I instinctively slowed down, not slamming on the brakes or anything, just easing off the gas. As my car approached, I got a clearer view, and that's when my heart started to race. There were 3 figures standing together at the roadside, just at the tree line. They were standing upright. That's the first thing that struck me as wrong. Completely upright, on 2 legs. And they were different heights, like a family. The tallest one was about 6 feet, if I had to guess. The middle one, maybe 4 feet tall. And the smallest couldn't have been more than 3 feet. All 3 were covered in this thick, dark hair, mostly dark brown, but the biggest one seemed almost black in places. The hair wasn't like a bear's coat. It was shaggy, uneven, hanging off their bodies in this way that looked almost unkempt. It covered them completely. I remember thinking how strangely they were standing, not like people waiting to cross a road, but almost like they were frozen in place, watching my approaching car with what seemed like confusion or hesitation. Their arms were what really caught my attention. They hung so low at their sides, way longer than human arms should be. Even the little one had these disproportionately long arms. By this point, I'd slowed to maybe 40 kilometers per hour, and I was probably about 50 meters away from them. Time felt like it was moving in slow motion. I remember my fingers tightening around the steering wheel until my knuckles were white. Then, without any warning, all 3 of them suddenly moved. It wasn't a slow, casual crossing. They bolted all at once, as if responding to some signal I couldn't perceive. They shot across the road in front of my car with this fluid, swift movement that I can only describe as graceful, but in a powerful way, not like a human running. More like an athlete in their prime, but even more natural and effortless. I had to brake harder to avoid hitting them, though they were well ahead of my car. The way they moved was just incredible, upright on 2 legs the entire time, arms swinging slightly, moving with this coordinated purpose. They crossed the entire width of the road in seconds and disappeared into the forest on the other side. I nearly stopped the car completely. There was this moment, this split second where curiosity almost overtook me. I almost pulled over to look, to try to see where they went. My hand was actually reaching for the gear shift, but then this wave of fear washed over me. Not just normal caution, but this primal gut-level fear that made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. My entire body went cold, and I broke out in goosebumps, despite the warm August air. Something deep inside me screamed, "Do not stop this car." So I didn't. I pressed the gas and drove away, probably faster than I should have. My hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the wheel with all my strength. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see them emerging from the trees and coming after me, though I don't know why I thought that. They had shown no aggression whatsoever. I've lived in this area my entire life. I know what bears look like, both black bears and grizzlies. I've seen moose, elk, deer, wolves, all the wildlife you'd expect in the forests of BC. I've seen them from distances and up close, in all seasons, in all types of light. What I saw that day wasn't any of those animals. The proportions were all wrong. The movement was wrong. The behavior was wrong. When I finally got home, my husband David knew something was off the moment I walked through the door. He said I was pale as a ghost. I blurted out the whole story to him and our 2 teenage sons, who had both looked up from the TV when they saw the state I was in. David tried to rationalize it, asked if it could have been bears standing oddly, or maybe even people in some kind of costumes. But who would be out in the middle of nowhere in costumes? And why would they run into the forest? And the way they moved, no human could move like that, costume or not. My older son Jake suggested we drive back out there to look for tracks or evidence, but I absolutely refused. That fear was still so fresh, I couldn't explain it, but something told me it would be a terrible idea. My younger son Ryan actually believed me right away. He'd been reading about Sasquatch sightings in BC for a school project just the month before and showed us some articles about similar sightings in the area going back decades. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing those figures in my mind, especially the smallest one. There was something so unsettling about seeing what looked like a child version of whatever these creatures were. It made them seem more real somehow, more, I don't know, legitimate, like they weren't just some monster or myth, but an actual species with families and young ones. The next morning, I almost convinced myself it had been some kind of stress hallucination or something. I'd been working long hours as a nurse, and maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew what I saw. A week later, I finally worked up the courage to drive back to that stretch of road in broad daylight with David. We walked along the roadside a bit, looking for any signs, broken branches, unusual tracks, anything. But of course, there was nothing definitive, just forest. David pointed out some areas where the underbrush seemed trampled, but that could have been anything. Over the years, I've thought about that day countless times. I've second-guessed myself, tried to rationalize it, tried to forget it, but I can't. The image of those 3 figures is etched into my memory with perfect clarity. The tallest one's protective stance, the middle one's hesitation, the smallest one staying close to the others. I've done research since then, lots of it. I've read about other sightings in BC, about the long history of Sasquatch stories from indigenous communities in the region. Some of the descriptions match what I saw with eerie similarity, especially the long arms, the varied heights, and the quick, fluid movement. One thing that's always bothered me is how they seem to communicate without making a sound. They decided to run at exactly the same moment, without any visible signal between them. It was like they shared some kind of silent understanding. That's not normal animal behavior, at least not like any I've ever observed. I've only told this story to a handful of people outside my family, a couple of close friends, my sister. Most react with polite skepticism or outright disbelief. One friend suggested I report it to some Bigfoot research group, but I never did. I was afraid of the attention, afraid of being labeled as that crazy Sasquatch lady in our community. But I know what I saw that day. Those weren't bears. They weren't people in suits. They were something else entirely. Something that, according to science and common knowledge, shouldn't exist, but they do. I saw them with my own eyes. It's been 20 years now since that day, but I still get chills when I drive that stretch of road. I still find myself scanning the tree line, half hoping and half fearing I'll catch another glimpse. I've never seen them again, but sometimes when I'm out in my garden in the early morning, I get this feeling of being watched. It's probably just my imagination, but I can't help wondering if they're out there, watching us the same way we might observe any other species. The most unsettling part is how it's changed how I see the forest. I grew up loving those woods, feeling at home among the trees. Now I'm aware there's something else sharing that space, something intelligent, something that moves in family units, something that can observe and react and make decisions, something that most people don't believe exists. Sometimes I wonder if they were as startled to see me as I was to see them. If that moment of hesitation I witnessed was them trying to decide what to do about this loud metal thing approaching them on their path. What goes through the mind of a creature like that? Do they have stories about us? Warnings they pass down about the humans and their noisy machines? I don't know if I'll ever have answers, but I know what I saw that August afternoon in 2003. A family of beings that shouldn't exist, but do. Moving with purpose through a world they share with us, even if most of us don't know they're there. Every once in a while, I'll read news reports about strange sounds in the forest at night or unexplained tracks found by hikers, and I think to myself, I know what made those. But I keep quiet. Because unless you've seen them yourself, standing there at the edge of the road, with the sunlight catching on their shaggy dark hair, their impossibly long arms hanging at their sides, you probably wouldn't believe me anyway. That day changed something fundamental in how I understand the world. There are things out there, intelligent things, that we don't acknowledge, that science doesn't recognize. They move through the forests of British Columbia, raising their young, living their lives parallel to ours, rarely seen but always there. And sometimes, if you're driving alone on a forest road on a clear summer day, you might just catch a glimpse of them too. If you do, you'll know I'm not crazy. You'll know I've been telling the truth all along, and you'll never look at the forest the same way again. Story 4. I've kept this story to myself for decades now, mainly telling just close friends because I was sick of being called a liar. But I need to get this off my chest once and for all. What happened to me in the summer of 1994 changed my life forever. I was 14 then, living with my parents and younger sister in Kelso, Washington. It was July, hot as hell, and school was out. My mum would give me a few bucks to pick up milk or whatever we needed from Fisher's Grocery about a mile from our house. There was this dirt trail that cut through the woods, connecting our neighborhood to the shopping center. Saved you like 15 minutes compared to taking the main road. I knew that trail like the back of my hand. Rode it on my bike almost every day that summer. It wasn't anything special, just packed dirt with trees crowding in on both sides. In some spots, the branches would meet overhead, making a sort of green tunnel. Usually I'd race through as fast as I could, feeling the cool air under the shade. That day started like any other. It was around 4 in the afternoon, and Mom needed hamburger buns for dinner. I remember being annoyed because I was in the middle of beating Sonic 3 on my Genesis, but she insisted it couldn't wait. So I grabbed my red Huffy mountain bike from the garage, stuffed the 20 bucks she gave me in my pocket, and headed out. The trail was empty as usual. Most kids from the neighborhood preferred hanging at the community pool than venturing through the woods. I was pedaling pretty fast, kicking up dust behind me, thinking about getting back to my game. About halfway down the trail, I remember noticing how quiet it had gotten. Usually you'd hear birds, or at least the distant sound of cars from the main road, but there was nothing. I slowed down a bit, suddenly feeling uneasy. There was this weird smell too, kind of like wet dog mixed with something rotten. I figured it was probably coming from the dumpster behind Fisher's. Everyone knew they tossed out expired meat and produce there. Sometimes you'd see raccoons, or even the occasional black bear rummaging through it if you went by late enough. As I rounded a bend in the trail, still about a quarter-mile from the grocery store, something massive exploded out of the trees directly in front of me. I mean right in front of me. I yanked the handlebars hard and slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. My front tire hit something, a rock or root, and I went flying over the handlebars. I landed hard on my side, the breath knocked out of me, my elbow and knee scraping against the dirt. For a second, I just lay there, dazed, trying to catch my breath. Then I looked up. Standing maybe 10 feet away was... I don't even know how to describe it properly. It was huge, way taller than any man I'd ever seen. 7, maybe 8 feet tall. It was standing on 2 legs, perfectly balanced, with a body covered in thick, matted brown hair. Not fur exactly, more like long human hair, but all over its body. The hair on its head and shoulders looked darker, almost black. Its build was strange, kind of lean but still powerful looking. The shoulders were incredibly wide, much wider than its waist. But what really struck me were its arms. They hung down almost to its knees, swinging slightly as it stood there. The hands looked almost human but bigger, with dark skin visible on the palms. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even think properly. We just stared at each other. Its face, God, I still see it in my nightmares. It wasn't like a gorilla or a bear. It was almost human, with a prominent brow ridge shadowing deep-set eyes. The nose was flat and wide, and beneath it was a mouth that looked too big for its face. Then it opened that mouth, and everything changed. The sound that came out of it started as a low rumble, like distant thunder. Then it built into this powerful, prolonged howl that seemed to vibrate through my entire body. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard, not a wolf or coyote or bear. It had these weird shifts in tone that no human throat could possibly make. High, then low, wavering in ways that felt almost like speech but definitely wasn't. The howl echoed through the trees, and I swear I felt it in my chest more than heard it with my ears. My whole body was trembling. I had pissed my shorts without even realizing it. I was sure, absolutely certain, I was about to die, but then, after what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds, the creature closed its mouth. Its eyes, dark and intelligent, stayed locked on me for one more moment. Then it just turned away. Not in a panic or rush, but deliberately, almost casually. It moved back toward the trees with these long, smooth strides. I could hear branches cracking and undergrowth crushing beneath its weight as it disappeared into the forest. The sound of its movement continued for several seconds after I couldn't see it anymore. I don't remember getting back on my bike. My next clear memory is pedaling harder than I ever had in my life, my heart feeling like it was going to explode. I abandoned the trail halfway and cut through Mrs. Donovan's backyard to get to our street faster. I'm pretty sure I was crying. When I burst through our front door, my mom started yelling about me not having the hamburger buns, but she stopped when she saw my face. I was white as a sheet, covered in dirt and blood from my scrapes, with wet shorts and tears streaming down my face. "Marcus, what happened to you?" she demanded, rushing over. I told her everything, the words pouring out of me in a rush. About the creature, how big it was, the sound it made, everything. I begged her to call the police or forest service or someone who could go look for it. The look on her face changed from concern to irritation as I spoke. "Not this again, Marcus," she sighed. "Last month it was a UFO over the baseball field. Now it's Bigfoot. This was real," I shouted, my voice cracking. "I swear to God, Mom." Dad came in from the garage, wanting to know what all the commotion was about. Mum just rolled her eyes and told him I'd seen Sasquatch on the trails. He laughed and ruffled my hair. "Son, you've been watching too many of those monster shows," he said. "Go clean yourself up and change. I'll go get the buns." "I'm not lying," I insisted, feeling desperate and alone. "It was right there in front of me. It howled at me." "Enough, Marcus," Mum said firmly. "Go upstairs and wash up, and no more making up stories for attention." I went to my room and slammed the door. I was shaking so hard I could barely get my clothes off. After showering, I spent the rest of the day going from window to window, checking outside, terrified the creature had followed me home. Every shadow in the yard made me jump. Every creak of the house settling made my heart race. That night at dinner, my 8-year-old sister kept making stupid howling noises, and my parents didn't even tell her to stop. I barely touched my food. For weeks afterward, I refused to go back on that trail. I'd take the long way around on the main road, adding 20 extra minutes to my trip. My friends thought I was being dramatic, and eventually I stopped trying to convince anyone what I'd seen was real. As the summer went on, I kept hearing rumors that made my blood run cold. Mr. Peterson's garbage cans being knocked over and crushed, not just tipped like raccoons would do. The Sullivan's dog refusing to go outside at night, whining and scratching at the door to get back in. Old man Jenkins claiming he heard ungodly wailing from the woods behind his property at 3 in the morning. I knew what was out there, but nobody would believe me. About a month after my encounter, I finally worked up the courage to go back to the spot. I convinced my friend Brian to come with me, though I didn't tell him the real reason why. I said I'd lost my Swiss Army knife there, the one my grandpa gave me. We brought Brian's dad's Polaroid camera, and I had this half-formed plan to try to find footprints or hair, something to prove I wasn't crazy. But when we got there, the area looked different. The undergrowth where the creature had disappeared was all broken down, with what looked like a crude path leading deeper into the woods. Brian wanted to follow it, but I made up some excuse about needing to get home. Later that fall, Fisher's Grocery installed a big floodlight and chain-link fence around their dumpster area after what the manager called repeated bear problems. But I knew it wasn't a bear. I'm 29 now, and I've never told this story publicly before. I've moved away from Kelso and rarely go back except for holidays with the family. When I do visit, I still get this cold feeling in my gut when we drive past that wooded area. I've researched similar encounters over the years and found countless stories that match elements of mine. The height, the howl, the intelligent eyes. I don't know what I saw that day. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, some unknown species. The name doesn't matter. What matters is that it was real, it was aware, and for some reason, it chose to let me go. Sometimes I wonder if I just caught it by surprise as it was heading to raid the grocery dumpster, or if there was something more deliberate in our meeting. To this day, I can't hear certain deep, resonant sounds without feeling that primal fear wash over me again. The rumble of distant thunder, the lowest notes on a pipe organ, the sound of wind through a narrow valley. They all bring me right back to that moment when I looked up from the dirt and saw something that shouldn't exist standing over me. I still have nightmares. In them, the creature doesn't turn away. In them, those long arms reach for me and I never make it home. But in reality, I did make it home. And since that day, I've never gone into the woods alone. Not once in 28 years. Some lessons you only need to learn once. Story 5. I still can't believe what I saw. It's been almost a year now, but I get goosebumps every time I drive that stretch of road outside Natchez. I've never shared this with anyone except my wife, who thinks I'm crazy, and my brother, who at least pretends to believe me. I need to get this off my chest because it's eating at me. I've lived in Mississippi my whole life. Been hunting these woods since I was 12. I know every critter that crawls, walks, or flies through this part of the state. I've seen bears, coyotes, wild hogs, you name it. But what I saw in January of 2023 wasn't anything I'd ever encountered before. It was a little after midnight on a Tuesday. I was driving home from my shift at the paper mill, dead tired and looking forward to crawling into bed. The rain had been coming down steady all evening, not a downpour, but enough to make the road slick and visibility poor. I always take Highway 61 where it cuts through some pretty remote stretches outside Natchez. There's this one part where the road runs alongside a swamp for about 5 miles. It's pitch black out there, no streetlights, no houses, just wilderness. The guardrail reflectors were doing their job that night, bouncing the light from my headlights back at me in a steady rhythm. White flash, white flash, white flash. I wasn't paying much attention until something caught my eye, a gap in the pattern, like something was blocking several reflectors in a row. I slowed down a bit, wondering if a deer was about to jump out, which happens all the time around here. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a deer. The shape was all wrong. It was tall and upright, straddling the guardrail like it was stepping over it. The figure was massive, wider than any human I've ever seen. For a split second, my headlights illuminated it, and I swear my heart stopped. Then it was gone, just vanished into the trees. The whole sighting couldn't have lasted more than 2 seconds. I nearly drove off the road trying to catch another glimpse in my rearview mirror, but there was nothing there except darkness and rain. I told myself I was tired, that my eyes were playing tricks on me. Maybe it was just a shadow or a large bird taking off. I actually laughed it off as I pulled into my driveway. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen wasn't normal. It was too big, too fluid in its movement to be anything I could easily explain away. I almost convinced myself it was nothing. Almost. About a week later, I was headed to work. It was early, around 8:30 in the morning. January in Mississippi isn't like January up north, but we were having a cold snap. The temperature was hovering just above freezing, and a miserable drizzle was coming down, turning everything a dull gray. I was driving the same stretch of highway, sipping my coffee, when something ahead made me ease off the gas. About 200 yards down the road, near the same spot as my previous sighting, something was moving at the edge of the tree line. At first, I thought it might be a hunter, though it would have been a strange place to hunt, right next to the highway and deep in swamp territory. But as I drew closer, maybe 100 yards away, I could see it clearly now. It wasn't a hunter. It wasn't human at all. The figure stepped out from the trees deliberately, like it had every right to be there. It moved with this weird confidence that made the hair on my arms stand up. It was completely black from head to toe, not clothing, but covered in what looked like dark hair or fur. The thing that struck me immediately was its proportions. Its arms hung down abnormally low, almost to its knees. The shoulders were impossibly wide, like a football player wearing pads, except there were no pads. The head sat directly on those massive shoulders, no neck that I could make out, and it was tall. I'm 6'1", and this thing had to be at least 7 feet, maybe taller. I slowed my truck to a crawl, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The creature didn't run or hurry. It just walked, smoothly, deliberately, straight across the road. Its gait was fluid but strange, like its knees bent differently than a human's would. When it reached the guardrail on the swamp side, it didn't climb over. It just stepped over it like it was nothing, then disappeared down into the swamp. My truck had almost come to a complete stop by then. I sat there, engine idling, wipers slapping back and forth, trying to process what I'd just seen. The rational part of my brain was searching for explanations. A bear walking upright? No, bears don't walk across roads like that, and the proportions were all wrong. A person in a costume, in freezing rain, at 8:30 in the morning, in the middle of nowhere? And who could move like that, with that kind of fluid grace while being that massive? I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a person, and it definitely wasn't any known animal I've encountered in 25 years of hunting these woods. After sitting there for what felt like forever but was probably only a minute, I put the truck in drive and slowly approached the spot where the creature had crossed. I was tempted to pull over and look for footprints, but something held me back. Fear, I guess. Not just fear of the creature, but fear of confirming what I'd seen was real. Sometimes it's easier to live with uncertainty than face a reality that changes everything you thought you knew. I drove to work in a daze, barely remembering the rest of my commute. All day at the mill, I couldn't focus. My co-workers asked if I was feeling okay. I mumbled something about not sleeping well and kept to myself. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I went online and started researching. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, skunk ape, whatever you want to call it. I'd always thought those stories were nonsense, just tall tales people made up for attention or misidentifications of known animals. But the more I read, the more accounts I found that matched what I'd seen. The height, the proportions, the way it moved, it all lined up. I found reports from all over Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama describing similar creatures, some dating back decades. Regular people, hunters, fishermen, hikers, who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by coming forward with their stories. People who, like me, knew the difference between a bear and whatever this was. The next day I took a different route to work. I told myself it was because of road construction, but that was a lie. I was avoiding that stretch of highway. It was 3 days before I worked up the courage to drive that road again. This time, I went during daylight, around 9 in the morning. The rain had stopped and the sun was out. I slowed down when I approached the area of the sightings and pulled onto the shoulder. The swamp stretched out before me, a tangle of cypress trees, their knees poking up through the murky water. The ground was soft and muddy from all the recent rain. I walked along the guardrail, looking for any sign of the creature, broken branches, unusual tracks, tufts of hair caught on the metal, anything. I didn't find much at first, just some disturbed mud that could have been made by anything. But then, about 20 feet from the road, down a slight embankment, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A footprint, a large human-like footprint pressed deep into the mud. It was at least 16 inches long and impossibly wide. The impression was clear enough that I could make out what looked like 5 toes. I didn't have anything to measure it with precisely, but comparing it to my own boot print nearby, it was nearly twice the size. I stood there staring at it, this tangible proof that I wasn't crazy, that what I'd seen was real. I thought about taking a picture with my phone, but what would I do with it? Show people and be labeled the local nut job? I decided against it. As I was standing there, a cold feeling washed over me. Not from the temperature, the sun was warming everything up nicely. This was different. It felt like I was being watched. I scanned the tree line, but saw nothing unusual. Still, the feeling persisted. I hurried back to my truck and got the hell out of there. The whole way home, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see that dark figure again. Those 2 sightings and the footprint changed me. I've always considered myself a rational person. I fix machines for a living. I understand how things work, cause and effect. But this experience forced me to accept that there are things in this world we don't understand. Things science hasn't explained yet. I've been back to that spot several times since then. Always in broad daylight, always with a sense of caution. I've never seen the creature again, but I found more tracks on 2 occasions. They always lead deeper into the swamp, into areas so waterlogged and tangled with vegetation that I can't follow. What strikes me most about my encounters is how calm the creature seemed. It wasn't aggressive. It didn't run away in panic. It moved with purpose, like it knew exactly where it was going and what it was doing, like it navigated that swamp every day of its life. I've tried talking to a few people about it. My wife just gives me that look, you know the one, like she's worried about my mental health. My brother listened more openly, but suggested it might have been a bear with mange or some other explanation. A couple of guys at work laughed it off. making jokes about me hitting the bottle too hard after my shift. So I stopped talking about it, but I haven't stopped thinking about it. There's an indigenous tribe in this region, the Natchez, who have stories about a creature they call the Nalusa Falaya, or long black being. When I read about that, chills ran down my spine. These stories go back hundreds of years. What if they've been trying to tell us something all this time? I'm not looking for fame or attention. I'm not trying to convince anybody. I know what I saw, and that's enough for me. But sometimes, when I'm driving that highway at night, I slow down near that spot. I scan the tree line and the gaps between the reflectors. Part of me hopes I'll see it again, definitive proof that I'm not crazy. Another part hopes I never do. The swamps of Mississippi hold secrets. Most people drive right by, focused on getting from point A to point B, never knowing what might be watching them from the shadows. I can't do that anymore. Now I notice every broken branch, every unusual sound, every gap in the pattern. I don't know if it was truly a Sasquatch I saw that day. I don't have a better name for it. All I know is that it was real, it was intelligent, and it shares these woods with us, moving quietly, just beyond the edges of our awareness. That stretch of highway will never look the same to me again, and neither will the woods I've known all my life. Some things once seen can't be unseen. Some knowledge, once gained, can't be forgotten. Whatever it was, it's out there. And sometimes when I'm alone in the woods, I swear I can feel it watching me, waiting. For what? I don't know, and I'm not sure I want to find out. Story 6. I've never been one to believe in the supernatural. 20 years in the Marines trains that out of you pretty quick. I've seen real horrors, war, death, human cruelty, but nothing prepared me for what's been happening at our home these past few weeks. I'm still trying to make sense of it all. My son Connor and I bought this place on the outskirts of Jasper, Georgia after I retired. Beautiful property, about 4 acres backing up to national forest land. The house itself needed work, which was fine. Fixing it up together was part of our plan. Connor's 32 now, wanted to move away from the city, and I was looking for something peaceful after a lifetime of chaos. That peace didn't last long. It was the second week of November 2012. The weather had turned cold, but we were still working on the back deck. That night, around 9:30, we were carrying lumber from my truck to the back of the house. I'd set up a utility pole light near the work area, which cast a decent circle of illumination into the yard. But beyond that was pure darkness. The forest wall may be 40 yards from the house. I was making another trip to the truck when I caught a whiff of something awful, like roadkill that's been sitting in the summer heat for days, mixed with something musky and wild. It hit me like a physical force. I remember pausing, board still in my hands, trying to figure out where it was coming from. That's when I noticed it. At first, I thought it was just another tree at the edge of the light. But then it moved. I'm not ashamed to admit I froze. 20 years in combat zones, and I stood there like a deer in headlights. The shape took a single step forward, entering the circle of light fully, and I realized I was looking at something impossible. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, maybe more. Built like a linebacker, but bigger, broader, with powerful shoulders that hunched forward slightly. The proportions were all wrong for a human. Arms too long, hanging down past its knees. They swung slightly as it took another deliberate step forward. The whole body was covered in thick grey hair, with patches of dark brown, especially around the shoulders and chest. Later, I'd wonder if that meant it was an older specimen, greying with age like humans do. Its face was partially obscured by shadow and hair, but I could make out deep-set eyes reflecting the light, a prominent brow ridge, and a wide, flat nose. There was intelligence in those eyes, not animal, not human either, something else. It stood there staring at me for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Then it took 3 more long, deliberate steps through the light, covering a good 10 feet of ground in what seemed like slow motion before disappearing into the darkness on the other side. "Dad?" Connor's voice snapped me back to reality. He was standing at the edge of the deck, looking concerned. "You okay?" I couldn't find the words at first. "What do you tell your adult son? That you just saw Bigfoot? That there's a monster in our woods?" I mumbled something about being tired and we finished up for the night, but I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying those few seconds over and over in my mind, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. I didn't tell Connor that night. Didn't tell anyone for 2 days. Then my brother James called. He's a pastor at the local Baptist church, lives about 3 miles down the same road. He was shaken up. "Thomas, something crossed my driveway last night," he said, voice trembling slightly. James isn't easily rattled. "I was coming home late from a church meeting, and when my headlights hit it, Tom, it wasn't human." The description he gave matched exactly what I'd seen. Massive, grey-brown hair, impossibly long arms. He'd gotten a better look at the face, said it had a prominent jaw, lips that pulled back to reveal teeth when it turned toward his headlights. Said it moved with purpose, intelligence. That's when I told him about my own encounter. We agreed to keep it between ourselves for the time being. No need to alarm the family or become the local crackpots. But 3 days after my first sighting, it returned. Connor and I were finishing up work around dusk. I kept glancing toward the tree line, half expecting to see it again. Then Connor nudged me. "Dad, what's that by the edge of the woods?" I looked where he was pointing. At first, it appeared to be a dark shape crouched low to the ground, maybe 50 yards out. As we watched, it slowly stood up, unfolding to its full height. Even at that distance, it was unmistakable. The same creature I'd seen before. Connor let out a quiet, "Holy shit," beside me. It just stood there watching us. I could feel a pressure building in my chest, a primal warning system telling me we were being hunted. After maybe 30 seconds, it turned and walked into the trees, visible for a few more moments as it moved between trunks before disappearing completely. "What the hell was that?" Connor's voice was steady, but I could see his hands shaking. "I don't know," I lied. "Let's head inside." That night, I finally told him about my previous sighting and about James's encounter. Connor took it surprisingly well. He'd been raised on hunting trips and outdoor survival. He knew enough about wildlife to understand that what we'd seen wasn't any recognized animal. Things escalated quickly after that. 2 days later, my nieces, James's daughters, Emily and Sarah, 11 and 9, were playing in our front yard while James and his wife Melissa were visiting. The girls came running inside, faces white with terror. "Something chased us!" Emily was crying, clutching her little sister's hand. "It was big and hairy and it threw rocks at us." We tried to calm them down, get a clearer story. They had been playing near the edge of the property when they heard something moving in the underbrush. Sarah said she saw a big hairy man watching them from behind a tree. When they started walking back toward the house, it followed them, keeping to the tree line. Then rocks started landing around them, not hitting them directly, but close enough to scare them into running. James and I grabbed our rifles, legal hunting weapons, nothing military grade, and went outside to investigate. We found disturbed ground near where the girls had been playing and several rocks that clearly hadn't been there before. These weren't pebbles either. Some were the size of softballs, heavy enough to seriously injure a child if they'd connected. We searched the area for about 20 minutes, finding nothing else unusual. As we turned to head back to the house, I caught James's arm. There, about 30 yards away, partially hidden behind a large oak tree, was the creature. It was so still I almost missed it, but once I saw those eyes reflecting back the fading daylight, there was no mistaking what I was looking at. James saw it too. We both raised our rifles instinctively, but neither of us fired. The creature didn't move, didn't threaten. It just watched us. After a tense standoff that lasted maybe 15 seconds, it simply turned and walked deeper into the forest, making surprisingly little noise for something so large. "Did you see the way it was hiding?" James whispered once it was gone. "It wasn't just standing there. It was concealing itself, watching us search." That thought was more unsettling than anything else. This wasn't just a wild animal acting on instinct. It was displaying tactical thinking, intelligence. That same night, around 11, I got a call from Martha Jenkins, our nearest neighbor, about a quarter-mile down the road. She's in her 70s, lived alone since her husband died, but sharp as a tack. "Thomas," she said without preamble, "there's something in my yard eating my pears." I asked if it was deer. They're common around here. "I know what a deer looks like," she replied irritably. "This thing is standing upright, reaching up and picking them straight off the tree. It's taller than my roof." My blood ran cold. "Martha, lock your doors. I'm coming over." I grabbed my rifle and was halfway to my truck when her voice came back on the line. "Wait, it's leaving now, heading toward your property, Thomas, through the woods." By the time I reached Martha's place 10 minutes later, whatever had been there was long gone. But under her pear tree, I found massive footprints in the soft soil, 18 inches long at least, with 5 distinct toes and a depth that suggested enormous weight. Martha said she'd watched it from her kitchen window, described the same creature James and I had seen, only she'd gotten a better look at its face, said it had a human quality to its eyes that disturbed her deeply. That was 2 weeks ago. Since then, the activity has intensified. We found trees damaged, not just broken branches, but entire trunks twisted and split in ways that would require tremendous strength. More rocks thrown toward the house, usually at night. Something pulled apart a stack of lumber we had covered with a tarp, scattering the boards over a 20-foot area. James has had 3 more sightings near his property. Connor and I have heard vocalizations at night, not quite howls, not quite screams, but something in between that makes the hair on your neck stand up, deep, resonant, and clearly not from any animal native to these woods. Last night was the worst. Around 3 in the morning, something hit the back deck with enough force to wake me from a dead sleep. I grabbed my rifle and flashlight and carefully approached the back door. Through the glass, I could see the utility light was still on, illuminating the yard. Standing directly in the center of that pool of light was the creature. It was the clearest view I've had yet, every detail of its massive frame visible. It was staring directly at the door, at me, with an intensity that felt like a physical force. In one hand, and I call it a hand, because that's what it was, not a paw, it held a large rock. As I watched, it deliberately placed the rock on the deck railing. Not threw it, placed it, like it was leaving a calling card. Then it made a sound, a low, rumbling vocalization that seemed to vibrate through the glass. It raised one hand, palm outward, in what I can only describe as a gesture of communication. Warning? I don't know. The meaning was unclear, but the intent was unmistakable. It was interacting with me purposefully. After a few seconds of this standoff, it turned and walked away, unhurried, disappearing into the darkness beyond the light's reach. I didn't sleep again. This morning, I went out to find the rock, a smooth river stone that doesn't match any others on our property, weighing at least 15 pounds. It had to have been carried here from somewhere else. I've spoken with a few other people in the area since all this began. 3 other families have reported similar encounters over the past few years. All describe the same creature, 8 feet tall, grey-brown hair, long arms, powerful build. All mention the intelligence in its eyes, the deliberate nature of its actions. I don't know what to do. Moving isn't an option. We've sunk everything into this property. Contacting authorities seems pointless. What would I tell them? That Bigfoot is harassing my family. I'd be laughed out of the county. So we wait. We watch. We keep our rifles loaded and our doors locked. Whatever this thing is, and I still hesitate to put a name to it, it's not going away. It was here before us, and it seems determined to let us know that this is its territory, not ours. The most disturbing part isn't the size or strength. It's the calculation behind its actions. The rocks thrown near children but not at them, the items taken and rearranged, the direct eye contact, the vocalizations that sound almost like attempts at communication. It's watching us even now. I can feel it when I step outside. That sensation of eyes on me from the tree line. Sometimes I catch glimpses of movement between trunks, too large and deliberate to be deer or bear. I don't know what it wants or how long this will continue, but I know what I've seen, what my family has seen. There's something in these woods that science can't explain, something intelligent and powerful that seems to be testing us, studying us, maybe even trying to communicate with us in its own way. And I can't shake the feeling that it's only a matter of time before it decides to do more than watch. Story 7. I've been hesitant to share this for a long time. 15 years of keeping it mostly to myself, with only a few close hunting buddies knowing what happened. I'm not the type to make up stories or chase legends. I've been hunting the woods of southeastern Oklahoma since I was 12, and at 43 years old in October 2007, I thought I'd seen everything these forests had to offer. I was wrong. It was the second weekend of bow season, and I had permission to hunt on a buddy's private land about 20 miles outside of Broken Bow. The property had this great setup, a green field that ran under some power line clearings with perfect visibility for deer. I had been watching this spot for weeks before the season opened, seeing multiple does and a couple decent bucks coming through regularly around dusk. That Saturday, October 13th, I got to my spot around 2:30 in the afternoon. The weather was perfect, about 65 degrees, light breeze, partly cloudy. I climbed up into my tree stand about 20 feet high with a clear view of the green field. I had my compound bow ready and settled in for what I hoped would be a productive evening. Everything was normal for the first few hours. I saw a couple of squirrels, some turkeys scratching around the edge of the clearing, and even a young spike buck that I let pass by around 4 o'clock. Too small, not worth taking. I remember checking my watch constantly, knowing the best action would start around 5, when the deer typically moved from their bedding areas to feed. Right around 5, I heard the first gunshot. It was distant, maybe half a mile away, which was odd because it was bow season. Could have been someone target practicing, I thought, or maybe hunting on different land with a special permit. Then I heard more shots and loud voices. Sounded like men whooping and hollering like they'd hit something big. I remember feeling annoyed. Whoever these guys were, they were making enough noise to spook every deer for miles. So much for my evening hunt. I was about ready to pack it up when I heard one particularly loud gunshot, closer than the others, followed by someone shouting this weird whooping call, like, "Whoop! Whoop!" What happened next still gives me chills. From the complete opposite direction, maybe a quarter mile from my position, came a response. A deep, guttural "whoo" that was longer, deeper, and definitely not human. It was followed by this bizarre chattering sound, almost like someone rapidly clicking their tongue against the roof of their mouth, but much louder, able to carry through the trees. I froze in my stand. That call didn't come from the hunters. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard in these woods, and I've heard everything from bobcats to coyotes to owls. My eyes immediately went to the tree line about 200 yards ahead of me, where the sound had come from. The sun was starting to get low, but there was still plenty of light. After scanning for maybe 30 seconds, I caught movement between the pines at the edge of the forest. At first, I thought it was a person. Something large was walking upright, moving steadily between the trees. I reached for my binoculars, but before I could get them to my eyes, this figure stepped into a partial clearing between two pine stands. I don't know how else to describe it, except to say it wasn't a person. It was too big, too wide. The height was hard to judge at that distance, but comparing it to the trees around it, I'd estimate at least 7, maybe 8 feet tall. It was covered in dark brown or black hair, not clothes, hair. And it moved with this smooth, deliberate stride that no person in a costume could manage. The figure stopped at the edge of a large brush pile about 180 yards from my position. It crouched down beside it, partially obscured but still visible. I thought maybe it was another hunter at first. Maybe someone in dark clothes who looked bigger than they were because of the distance and fading light. I stood up in my stand and waved my arm, thinking I should make myself visible so they'd know another hunter was in the area. The figure didn't react at all. It just stayed there, crouched and motionless, seeming to watch or listen to something. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I wasn't scared yet, more confused than anything. I kept thinking of rational explanations. A bear standing up? No, it walked too far on 2 legs. Another hunter? The size and proportions were all wrong. Someone playing a prank? Who would go this deep into private property just to scare a random hunter? I watched it for what must have been 15 minutes, barely breathing. It never moved from that spot. Eventually, the sound of an ATV somewhere in the distance seemed to catch its attention. The figure's head turned toward the noise, and then, with a deliberate motion, it simply moved back into the thicker pines and disappeared. I waited another 30 minutes until dusk was really setting in before I climbed down from my stand. I didn't take the usual path back through the woods to my truck. Instead, I kept to the open area under the power lines, walking backward half the time, keeping my eyes on that spot where the figure had been. My bow was in my hand with an arrow nocked the whole time, though I don't know what good it would have done. When I got back to my truck, I sat there for a while, trying to process what I'd seen. I didn't leave right away. Instead, I turned the truck around so my headlights were pointing toward that section of the tree line and just watched. Nothing moved again. Eventually, I convinced myself it must have been another hunter, maybe wearing some kind of ghillie suit or something, and I drove home. But I couldn't get it out of my head. I barely slept that night, replaying the image of that figure walking between the trees, the unnatural fluidity of its movement. And that sound, that deep whooping call and the chattering, kept echoing in my mind. The next morning, I went back. I know that sounds crazy, but I had to know what I'd seen. This time I brought my rifle, even though it wasn't rifle season yet, and my buddy's German Shepherd, Max. I figured having the dog along would make me feel safer, plus he might pick up on anything unusual. I parked in the same spot and walked the power line clearing until I was roughly across from where I'd seen the figure the day before. Then I cautiously moved into the trees, Max leading the way. The dog seemed unusually hesitant, which wasn't like him at all. Usually he'd be running ahead, sniffing everything, but that day he stayed close to my legs. When we got to the brush pile, where the figure had crouched, Max stopped completely and refused to go any closer. His hackles were up and he kept making this low growling sound I'd never heard him make before. The ground around the brush pile was hard-packed dirt and pine needles, so I couldn't make out any clear tracks or footprints, but there was something else, a smell. A strong, musky odor that reminded me of wet deer, but stronger and more pungent. It hung heavy in the air around that brush pile. We hadn't had rain in over a week, and there were no deer carcasses or scat nearby that could explain it. As I stood there trying to figure out what could have left that smell, Max suddenly turned and bolted back toward the clearing. He stopped about 30 yards away and just stood there, barking at me to follow him. I've never seen a trained hunting dog act like that. I took one last look around and noticed something I hadn't seen at first. Some of the branches on the brush pile had been rearranged with fresh breaks in the wood. Something had been manipulating those branches recently. I didn't stay long after that. The whole atmosphere felt wrong. The birds were quiet, no squirrels moving around. The forest had that eerie stillness that usually means a predator is nearby. Max and I walked back to the truck quickly, and I didn't return to that hunting spot for the rest of the season. Here's the thing, I've been a skeptic my whole life. I've heard the Bigfoot stories around campfires and always laughed them off, but I've been reading reports from that area since then, and what I saw fits the pattern perfectly. The upright walking, the whooping calls and responses, the way it just watched from a distance without approaching, that distinctive musky smell people describe. The thing that bothers me most isn't what I saw that day, but what happened in the weeks after. The property owner told me they found 3 of their game cameras smashed, not just damaged, but completely destroyed, like something had grabbed them and crushed them in its hands. A neighbor half a mile down reported their outdoor dog went missing the same weekend, never to return. And several hunters in the area packed up and left early that season, not saying exactly why, just that they didn't feel right about the woods this year. I went back the following season with more game cameras and placed them higher in the trees. Most captured nothing unusual, but one, the farthest into the property, recorded something at 3:27 a.m. that still makes me question everything I know about those woods. The infrared camera caught what looks like a large, shadowy figure moving between the trees. The quality isn't great, and it's only visible for about 4 seconds, but the height and proportions match exactly what I saw that day. I've shown the footage to a few friends who hunt that area. Some laugh it off as a bear or a person, but others get quiet, then tell me their own stories of strange calls in the night, of feeling watched in the woods, of finding tree structures that no human had any reason to build miles from any trail. I don't know what's out there in those Oklahoma woods. I still hunt, but never alone anymore, and never in that specific area. I've spent years trying to convince myself that what I saw had a simple explanation. But deep down, I know better. Whatever answered that hunter's call that October evening wasn't human. And sometimes, when I'm in the woods and the sun starts to get low, I catch myself scanning the tree line, listening for that distinctive whooping sound, hoping I never hear it again, but somehow knowing that it's still out there, watching and waiting in the shadows between the pines. Story 8. I've been hunting these woods all my life. I'm talking 36 years of knowing every tree, creek, and game trail around Columbia, like the back of my hand. Nothing out here ever surprised me. Not until that day. It was early summer of 2006, a day like any other. I decided to head out to my usual spot, a fence line bordering a pine thicket about half a mile from my house. Nothing special about it, really. Just a good place to wait for deer. I'd taken my Jack Russell Terrier, Buster, with me like I always did. That little dog was the best hunting companion I'd ever had, never barked unless there was something worth barking at, and he had this way of alerting me to game before I'd spot it myself. The morning was quiet, maybe too quiet, looking back. I should have noticed how the birds weren't singing much. I was just sitting there on my folding stool, rifle across my lap, Buster laying at my feet. We'd been there maybe an hour when something changed. I felt it before I saw anything, this weird tension in the air. Buster felt it too. His ears perked up and he was suddenly alert, staring into the pine thicket across the fence line. That's when they came. 5 or 6 deer bursting out of the thicket like their tails were on fire. Now, I've seen deer spooked before. Happens all the time when they catch your scent or hear something that puts them on edge. But this was different. These deer weren't just spooked, they were terrified. They raced along the net wire fence, frantic, looking for a way across. When they finally jumped it about 75 feet down from where I was sitting, I could see they were shaking. Every muscle in their bodies was trembling. Never seen anything like it. Buster, of course, took off after them. That's what he does, but I wasn't worried. He always comes back within a few minutes. So I kept watching the tree line, wondering what had spooked those deer so badly. Another hunter, maybe? A coyote? But something didn't feel right. About 10 minutes later, Buster came trotting back. He stopped about 20 feet from me and turned to look back toward the thicket. That's when I saw something I'd never seen before. My dog was scared. I mean, genuinely terrified. His hackles rose up and he made this sound, not a bark or a growl, but this high-pitched yelp that raised the hair on the back of my neck. Then he bolted straight past me, heading for home faster than I'd ever seen him run. Now you gotta understand, Buster isn't afraid of anything. He's confronted bobcats 3 times his size without flinching. But something in those woods scared him so badly, he abandoned me without a second thought. I almost got up to follow him, but then I heard it, movement in the trees, heavy movement. At first, I thought maybe a black bear, though we don't get many around here. But then those same deer came charging back in the opposite direction, crossing the fence again, clearly desperate to get away from whatever was in there. The sound got louder, branches snapping, undergrowth crushing under heavy weight, not like a deer moving through brush, more deliberate, more powerful. I could feel the vibration in the ground beneath my stool. That's when it emerged from the tree line. I'm not a man who scares easily. I've come face to face with wild boars that could rip you open in seconds. I've had close calls with cottonmouths while fishing, but nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what stepped out of those pines. It was walking upright. That's the first thing that hit me. Upright, on 2 legs, like a man, but not a man. Tall. So goddamn tall. I'd guess 7, maybe 8 feet. Covered in dark reddish-brown hair. Not fur exactly, more like hair, long arms that hung down past its knees. It moved with this strange grace that doesn't make any sense for something that big. It wasn't lumbering or clumsy. It was fluid, purposeful. It followed the same path the deer had taken walking along the fence line. When it reached the fence, it just stepped over it. Didn't jump, didn't climb. Just lifted one long leg and stepped over a 4-foot fence like it was nothing, then continued walking downhill. The whole time, it never looked at me, never acknowledged I was there, though I was only about 50 yards away. I know it knew I was there, had to, but it just ignored me. Like I wasn't worth bothering with. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My finger was on the trigger of my rifle, but I didn't raise it. Something deep inside told me not to. This wasn't something to shoot at. This was something to witness and then leave alone. It disappeared into the trees on the other side of the clearing, maybe 30 seconds after it first appeared. The whole encounter couldn't have lasted more than a minute, but it changed everything I thought I knew about these woods. I sat there for another hour, unable to process what I'd seen. Part of me wanted to follow it, to see where it went. The smarter part kept me glued to that stool until my legs cramped and the sun had moved significantly across the sky. When I finally got up, my knees were shaking so bad I almost fell over. I picked up my rifle and headed straight home, constantly looking over my shoulder. I half expected to see it watching me from the trees, but there was nothing. Buster was waiting on the porch when I got back, still trembling. He wouldn't go outside again for the rest of the day, not even to do his business. I had to carry him out and stand right there with him. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. Who would believe me? I've heard the Bigfoot stories all my life. Always figured they were just that, stories. Things hunters tell around campfires after a few too many beers, but I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a man in a suit. It was something else. Something that shouldn't exist, but does. For a few days, life went back to normal. I even convinced myself that maybe I'd seen something ordinary and my mind had played tricks on me. Maybe it was just a really tall man out hunting. Maybe the stress of work and my recent divorce had finally caught up with me. But then came July 1st, 2006, a date I'll never forget. It was a Saturday night, around 11 p.m. I was sitting on my porch having a beer, trying to cool off from the heat of the day. My 3 dogs were out in the yard, Buster and my 2 coonhounds, Duke and Daisy. They seemed fine, just lounging around like normal. The night was quiet except for the usual chorus of crickets and frogs down from the creek. Stars were out, half moon, peaceful until it wasn't. It started as a low sound carrying from the hollow on my neighbor Jim's property, maybe a quarter-mile directly in front of my house. At first, I thought it might be Jim's tractor. He sometimes works late during planting season, but this was different. This was vocal. A low, throaty howl that rose in pitch until it became something between a scream and a roar. It echoed across the hollow, bouncing off the hills surrounding my property, making it impossible to pinpoint exactly where it was coming from. My dogs went nuts. Duke and Daisy started baying like they'd treed something, but they weren't running toward the sound. They were backing up toward the porch. Buster just started whimpering and scratching at the door to be let in. The sound stopped for maybe 30 seconds. Then it came again, louder this time, closer. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard in these woods before. Not a coyote, not a cougar, not a bear, not an owl. Nothing natural makes a sound like that. But I recognized it. A few weeks before, after seeing that thing in the woods, I'd gone online and looked up Bigfoot recordings. Just out of curiosity, mind you. I'd found some websites with supposed Bigfoot vocalizations recorded by researchers. I'd listened to them and thought they sounded fake. What I heard that night wasn't fake. It was the same type of vocalization, but real, powerful. You could feel it in your chest when it called out. The calls continued for several minutes, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, like whatever was making them was moving around the perimeter of Jim's property. My dogs were in a complete panic by then. I'd let Buster in, but Duke and Daisy were still outside, huddled against the porch steps, growling and whining. I went inside and grabbed my rifle, not because I planned to use it, but because having it in my hands made me feel less helpless. I stepped back onto the porch just as another vocalization started, and then something happened that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. Something answered from the opposite direction. A second voice, deeper than the first, called back from somewhere behind my property line, in the direction of the pine thicket where I'd seen the creature days before. They were communicating, two of them calling back and forth to each other across my property. I stood there frozen, rifle in hand, as they called to each other for maybe 5 minutes. Then, abruptly, they stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the sounds had been. That's when I noticed something else. All the normal night sounds had ceased. No crickets, no frogs, nothing. The world around me had gone completely silent except for the nervous panting of my dogs. I stayed on that porch all night, didn't sleep a wink, just sat in my chair with my rifle across my lap, jumping at every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves. The normal night sounds eventually returned around 3 in the morning, which I took as a sign that whatever had been out there had moved on. When dawn broke, I walked the property line. Didn't find anything obvious at first, no footprints, no broken branches. But when I got to the edge of my field where it meets Jim's property, I found something that made my blood run cold. A pine sapling, about 3 inches thick, had been snapped, not cut, not broken by wind, but deliberately snapped about 5 feet up from the ground. The top was twisted and pointed in the direction of my house, like a marker, like a sign. I knew then that what I'd seen and heard wasn't just passing through, it was living here. Had probably been living here all along, in the spaces between our properties, in the hollows and thickets we rarely ventured into. I mentioned it to Jim a few days later, just asked if he'd heard any strange noises coming from the hollow on his land. The look on his face told me everything before he even spoke. He'd heard them too, had been hearing them on and off for months, but was afraid to bring it up for fear of sounding crazy. We compared notes, and it turns out I wasn't the only one who'd seen something. Jim's teenage son had come home one evening from hunting and refused to go back out, saying he'd seen a giant hairy man watching him from across the creek. Jim had dismissed it as teenage imagination, but now he wasn't so sure. Word gets around in a small community like ours. Over the next few weeks, I heard from 3 other hunters who'd had similar experiences in the same general area, all describing tall, upright figures moving through the pines, around the same hollows, always at dusk or dawn or during the night. I still hunt those woods, still walk the same fence lines and sit in the same blinds. But I'm different now, more cautious, more aware. I don't go out after dark anymore. Don't let my dogs run free like I used to. And I always have the feeling I'm being watched. Sometimes at night, especially when there's a full moon, I'll hear those calls again, floating across the hollow. Not as close as they were that night, but there, reminding me that these woods don't just belong to us. I don't know what to call what I saw. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever, the name doesn't matter. What matters is that it's real, it's intelligent, and it's been living alongside us without most people ever knowing. I keep a journal now where I record every strange sound, every unusual track, every broken tree or twisted sapling I find on my property. Maybe someday I'll have enough evidence to convince others. Or maybe I'll just keep it to myself, a secret shared between me, these woods, and whatever watches me from the shadows when I walk the fence line where I first saw it. All I know for sure is that the woods I thought I knew for 36 years aren't the woods I know now. And sometimes ignorance really is bliss. Story 9. I've been sitting on this experience for decades now, but after seeing some of your posts, I finally feel like maybe I won't be completely ridiculed for sharing what happened to me. Even now, nearly 70 years later, I can close my eyes and see every detail like it happened yesterday. This was October 1955. I'm Marcus Holloway, and back then I was 32 years old. I'd spent my whole life in the wilderness, tracking, hunting, studying wildlife behaviors. My father taught me everything about animal patterns, and I'd tracked just about every creature in the Canadian wilderness. I thought I'd seen it all until that day on Mica Mountain. I'd been planning to explore an old abandoned mine shaft near Tech Joan Cache for months. It's about 80 miles west of Jasper, Alberta. Remote as hell even by today's standards, but back then it was practically another planet. The area wasn't completely unmapped, but it was the kind of wilderness where you could go weeks without seeing another human being. The morning started like any other expedition. I packed light, my Winchester rifle, more out of habit than anything, a canteen, some jerky, and a small notebook I always carried to document interesting findings. The weather was crisp but not unbearable, probably around 45 degrees. Perfect hiking weather. I remember the climb up Mica Mountain vividly. The trail wasn't maintained, so I was basically forging my own path through dense pine and spruce. The smell of those trees mixed with the earthy scent of fallen leaves is something I can still recall perfectly. My boots were getting soaked from the morning dew, but I'd been walking for about 4 hours and was making good progress. Around midday, I finally reached the area where the old mine was supposed to be. The entrance was partially collapsed, just a dark hole in the mountainside surrounded by rotting timber supports. I didn't actually plan to go inside, I'm not that stupid, but I wanted to document it and maybe collect some mineral samples from around the entrance. I found a small rock outcropping about 50 yards from the mine entrance and sat down to have some water and jerky. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional bird call and the wind rustling through the pine needles. I remember thinking how peaceful it was. That's when I noticed movement in the brush about 75 yards down the slope. My first thought was, grizzly. I'd encountered plenty of bears before, and my hand instinctively moved toward my rifle. But something felt off about the movement pattern. Bears have a distinctive way of moving through brush, and this wasn't it. I sat completely still, my jerky halfway to my mouth, just watching. Then it emerged partially from the thicket, and I swear my heart stopped for a second. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. At first glance, it looked almost human, but Wrong. It stood upright, probably around 6 feet tall, but much broader and heavier than any person I'd ever seen. I'd guess around 300 pounds, but it was solid, not fat. The entire body was covered in dark brown hair, thick and matted in some places. The hair had silver tips that caught the sunlight when it moved. I realized I was holding my breath and had to force myself to breathe normally. My mind was racing, trying to categorize what I was seeing. A bear standing on its hind legs. No, the proportions were all wrong. Some kind of ape? There aren't any native to North America. The creature moved with purpose, seemingly unaware of my presence. It was clearly female. I could tell from certain anatomical features. But its torso didn't have the curves you'd expect. It was more primitive looking, I guess you could say. Powerful. The shoulders were incredibly broad, and its arms hung lower than a human's would, almost reaching mid-thigh. I stayed frozen on that rock, afraid that any movement would send it bolting off into the forest. Part of me wanted it to run. I was terrified. But the scientist in me was absolutely captivated. I'd heard the Sasquatch legends, of course. Everyone in British Columbia has. But I'd always dismissed them as campfire tales. The creature moved closer to my position, still apparently unaware of me. It was now only about 20 feet away, partially obscured by some low pine branches. It squatted down in a way that seemed unnervingly human and began pulling branches toward itself. I could see its hands clearly now. They were like oversized human hands with opposable thumbs, but the fingers were thicker and the palms broader. The nails were more like blunt claws, dark-colored and thick. What struck me was how methodical it was. It stripped leaves from the branches and ate them with careful, deliberate movements. I could see its teeth when it opened its mouth, surprisingly white and even, not what you'd expect from a wild creature. The incisors were larger than human teeth, but not dramatically so. I had a perfect view of its face now. The nose was broad and flat, almost like a gorilla's, but smaller. Its lips protruded slightly, as did its chin. The eyes were small and dark, reminding me of a black bear's eyes, but with a different quality to them. There was something behind them that bears don't have. Intelligence, awareness. The creature's head shape was distinctive, higher at the back than the front, with a slight ridge running from front to back. The hair on its head was the same as the body, dark brown with those silver-tipped strands, but slightly longer. The rest of the body had short, dense hair covering it, though less on the face, palms, and what I could see of its feet. I must have been watching for 15 minutes, barely breathing, when everything changed. The wind shifted, I felt it on my face, and in that instant, I knew what was about to happen. The creature's head snapped up, nostrils flaring. It had caught my scent. For a moment it just froze, head partially turned in my direction, clearly processing the new information. Then, slowly, it turned fully toward me and stared directly through the brush between us. I've never experienced anything like that moment. Our eyes locked, and I felt something I can't properly explain. A connection, a recognition of some kind. Not recognition like it knew me personally, but like two intelligent species acknowledging each other's existence. There was surprise in those eyes, definitely, but not fear, not initially. For what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds, we just stared at each other. I didn't move, I barely breathed. My rifle lay uselessly at my side. I couldn't have reached for it if I wanted to. I was completely transfixed. Then the creature made a sound, a soft huffing noise, and slowly, deliberately stood up to its full height. Standing upright, it was even more impressive. Its chest expanded as it took a deep breath, still holding my gaze. Then it took a step backward, then another. It never turned its back to me, just kept those dark eyes locked on mine as it retreated. There was no panic in its movements, just caution and something that looked almost like curiosity. I had the most bizarre thought in that moment. I could shoot it. I could kill this creature and bring back proof of what I'd seen. My name would be in scientific journals. Museums would display the body. I'd be famous. But I couldn't. Looking into those eyes, seeing the clear intelligence there, it would have been like murder. I let my hand move away from my rifle, making a small, deliberate gesture to show I meant no harm. The creature paused, its head tilting slightly as if trying to understand my action. Then it made the most extraordinary sound. It's hard to describe even now. It was like a cross between a laugh and speech, a vocalization that had clear structure but wasn't any language I recognized. That sound has haunted my dreams for decades. Then it turned and walked away, disappearing into the pines with shocking speed and silence for something so large. The whole encounter had lasted maybe 20 minutes, but it felt both instantaneous and eternal. I sat on that rock for another hour, completely stunned. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't write in my notebook. I kept expecting it to return, but the forest remained silent, except for the normal sounds of birds and wind. Eventually, I worked up the courage to move. I approached the area where the creature had been sitting. The ground was disturbed, branches broken and vegetation crushed. In the soft earth, I could see footprints. Not clear ones, just depressions really, but they were unmistakably foot-shaped and much larger than my own boots. I found what I believe were its droppings nearby, vegetable matter mostly, supporting my observation of it eating leaves. What struck me was the absence of anything man-made in the area. No fire pit, no tools, no structures of any kind. If this was Sasquatch, it wasn't using technology in any way I could recognize. About 50 yards farther into the forest, I discovered what appeared to be a rudimentary sleeping area, just a depression in the ground with some pine boughs arranged in it. The surrounding vegetation was disturbed in a way that suggested the creature had been in the area for some time. By this point, the sun was starting to lower, and I knew I needed to head back down the mountain. The thought of being in those woods after dark, knowing what was out there, was more than I could handle. The hike down was a blur. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling watched the entire time. Every sound in the forest made me jump. I made it back to my truck just as darkness was falling, and I sat there with the engine running for a long time, trying to process what I'd seen. Here's the thing. I never told anyone the full story until now. Who would believe me? I mentioned seeing something strange to a couple of close friends over the years, but I always downplayed it. The few times I hinted at what I'd really seen, I got exactly the reactions you'd expect. Skepticism, concern, or worst of all, the patronizing nod that says, "Sure you did, buddy." But I know what I saw that day. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man in a suit. It was something in between. Something that shouldn't exist according to science, but was as real as the trees and rocks around me. The experience changed me. I continued my work as a naturalist, but I was always looking, always hoping for another glimpse. I never saw another one, though there were times in the deep wilderness when I felt that same sense of being watched, of not being alone. I've read every Sasquatch report that's come out in the decades since. Some sound like hoaxes or misidentifications, but some have details that match what I saw so perfectly that I know the observers must have had a real encounter too. The descriptions of the movement, the intelligence in the eyes, the way they retreat without turning their backs. These aren't things you'd make up or guess. I'm an old man now. I've got nothing to gain by making this up, and frankly, I don't care anymore if people think I'm crazy. I know what I saw on Mica Mountain in 1955. I looked into the eyes of something that science says doesn't exist, and it looked back at me with awareness and intelligence. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd made a different choice, if I'd called out to it, or followed it, or heaven forbid, shot it. But mostly I'm grateful for the encounter exactly as it was. For just a few minutes, I glimpsed a mystery that most people will never know exists. That laugh-speak sound it made as it left. Sometimes I still hear it in my dreams. It sounded almost like it was trying to communicate, to say something specific. What message was a supposedly non-existent creature trying to share with me? I'll never know, but I'll also never forget. Story 10. I've never told this story online before. Hell, I've barely told it to anyone outside my immediate family and a couple of close friends who probably think I'm nuts anyway. But I'm getting older now, and I figure someone should know what happened back in '66. My name's Victor Sullivan. I owned a small logging operation in Grays Harbor County, Washington back in the '60s. Nothing fancy, just me and about 15 guys working the timber around Capola's beach area. We were doing all right for ourselves. Steady contracts, decent income, enough to keep the wives happy and the kids fed. Richard Collins was one of my best workers. Reliable guy, showed up on time, never complained, knew his way around every piece of equipment we had. He'd been with me for almost 7 years, lived out on this 5-acre plot about 20 minutes from our main operation. Nice little place, modest house, couple of pigs, some chickens. His wife Sarah was sweet as could be. They had 2 boys, Kevin, who was 12, and little Danny, just 4 years old at the time. That Monday morning in July is burned into my memory like a brand. It was supposed to be just another start to the week. We had a big order to fill, and I was checking inventory when I noticed Richard was late. That was unusual. In 7 years, the man had maybe been late twice, both times with good reason and a phone call in advance. When he finally showed up around 10, I was shocked by his appearance. Richard was normally clean cut, but that morning he looked like he'd been through hell. Hair all messed up, 3-day stubble, dark circles under bloodshot eyes. His clothes were wrinkled like he'd slept in them. "Jesus, Rich, what happened to you?" I asked. He just stared at me for a second like he was trying to figure out if I was real. "Vic," he said finally, his voice gravelly from what I assumed was lack of sleep. "Something destroyed my house this weekend." I brought him into my office, sat him down, and poured him a coffee with a shot of whiskey I kept in my desk for cold mornings. I figured he'd tell me about a bad storm or maybe a break-in. What I heard instead changed everything I thought I knew about the world. It had started the previous Friday. Richard was working in the yard when Danny came running up to him, all excited like kids get. "Daddy! Daddy! I saw a cowman by the fence!" Danny kept saying. Richard thought Danny was playing make-believe, told him to go back to his mother while he finished his chores. But Danny was insistent, saying the cowman was big and furry and standing by their back fence. Richard finally walked over to check it out, mostly to humor the kid. He didn't see anything unusual, just their property backing up against the dense forest that covered most of that area. He told Danny it was probably just a bear or a deer, though bears weren't all that common near their place. That evening, Kevin had gone to check their mail at the box near the main road, about a quarter-mile walk through the woods on a dirt path. When he came back, he was out of breath, eyes wide. "Dad, something was following me in the woods," Kevin said. Richard asked what he meant, and Kevin explained he'd heard heavy footsteps behind him, breaking branches, but whenever he stopped to look, the sounds would stop too. Then when he started walking again, the footsteps would resume, closer each time. By the time he reached the house, Kevin was running full sprint. Richard told me he'd grabbed his hunting rifle and walked out with Kevin to check the path. Kevin pointed to where he first heard the sounds, about halfway to the road. As they moved through the trees, Richard noticed something odd, a strange, musky odor, like something had died mixed with wet dog and skunk. Most hunters know what I'm talking about, that unmistakable wild animal smell, but much stronger than anything I'd ever encountered. Near their back fence line, they found something that made Richard pause. Tangled in the barbed wire was a clump of long, reddish-brown hair, not like a deer or any local wildlife. It was too long, almost like human hair, but coarser. Richard took it, meaning to show it to a buddy of his who worked as a game warden, but in everything that followed, it got lost. While they were out there, Richard said he felt like they were being watched. It wasn't just paranoia. Any hunter knows that feeling when eyes are on you. The woods had gone quiet too. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. That's always a bad sign. I told Kevin to run back to the house, Richard explained to me, his hands shaking around his coffee mug. I thought maybe it was some vagrant camping illegally on our property. I called out saying I was armed and they should show themselves. What he saw next made my blood run cold just hearing about it. Richard said initially he only saw movement between the trees, something large shifting in the shadows about 50 yards away. Then it moved into a partial clearing and Richard froze. "Vic, I swear to God this thing was huge," he told me, his voice dropping. 7, maybe 8 feet tall. Not skinny either, massive shoulders thick all over. And the eyes... He paused, swallowing hard. Its eyes caught the setting sun and they looked red, like they were glowing. Richard said he stood there, rifle half raised, completely paralyzed. The creature stared at him for what felt like minutes, but was probably just seconds. Then it made a move that shook Richard to his core. It grabbed a small tree, maybe 6 inches in diameter, and snapped it with one twist like it was nothing more than a twig. That's when Richard knew he was dealing with something impossibly strong. He yelled for Kevin to run faster, and the sound seemed to trigger something in the creature. It dropped to all fours and began racing through the woods toward Kevin, faster than Richard had ever seen anything move. Richard fired a shot into the air, hoping to scare it off. The creature didn't even flinch. If anything, it accelerated. Richard said he'll never forget watching as this thing covered the distance to his son in seconds. It caught up to Kevin just as the boy reached the yard, swung one massive arm, and sent him flying about 10 feet through the air. Kevin landed hard, but scrambled to his feet and made it to the porch where Sarah was standing, alerted by the gunshot. By the time Richard reached the yard, the creature had disappeared back into the woods. Kevin was shaken, but miraculously unhurt, aside from some bruises and scratches. Richard didn't know what to think. Part of him wanted to call the sheriff. But what would he say? That some giant, hairy monster had attacked his son? They'd think he was drunk or crazy. That night, they locked all the doors and windows. Richard kept his rifle by the bed and a shotgun in the living room. Around 2 in the morning, Danny woke them up, standing in their bedroom doorway. "The cowman talked to me," Danny said, rubbing his eyes sleepily. Sarah brought Danny into their bed, while Richard grabbed his rifle and checked Danny's room. The window was still locked, but Richard noticed muddy smudges on the outside of the glass. Danny's room was on the ground floor, but the window was still a good 5 feet from the ground. "What did the cowman say?" Richard asked his son once he checked the entire house. Danny made a series of low, growling sounds, then said, "He has Lincoln log teeth." Richard said he felt sick when Danny bared his teeth to show what he meant, picturing some creature with giant teeth standing at his 4-year-old's window. The next morning, Richard found more evidence that this wasn't just imagination. In a muddy patch near the house was a footprint, a bare footprint that measured 18 inches long and nearly 8 inches wide. Richard tried to take a picture of it, but their old camera was out of film. By the time he drove into town for more, rain had washed it away. There were muddy fingerprints on Danny's window, 7 feet up from the ground, and worst of all, their 2 pigs were missing from the pen. The gate was still latched, but the pigs were gone with no blood or signs of struggle. Just gone. Saturday night was even worse. Richard had convinced Sarah they needed to leave, but they couldn't pack up and go until morning. They all slept in the living room, doors barricaded, windows locked. Around midnight, they heard heavy breathing outside Danny's window again. Richard crept over and could make out a massive silhouette. When the creature pressed against the glass, the whole window frame began to bend inward. Sarah screamed and Richard fired a shot through the window. The glass shattered, and they heard a roar that Richard said sounded halfway between a gorilla and a man in pain. Sarah grabbed the shotgun and fired too. The creature disappeared, but they heard it circling the house all night, trying different windows, rattling the doors. By dawn, they were terrified and exhausted. They threw some clothes in suitcases and drove straight to Richard's brother's place in Elmer, about 30 miles away. They stayed there for 3 days before Richard worked up the courage to go back, with his brother and me accompanying him. What we found still gives me nightmares. The house looked like it had been hit by a tornado, but only from the inside. Furniture was overturned, not just tipped over, but thrown across rooms. Their heavy console TV had been picked up and thrown through a wall. The kitchen table was splintered in half. There were deep scratches in the wooden floors, and this is what really got me, cracks in the ceiling where something tall had apparently stood up and hit its head. But the part that still haunts me was Danny's room. While the rest of the house was destroyed in what looked like rage, Danny's room was different. His bed was carefully moved to the center of the room. His toys were arranged in a bizarre circle around it, and on his pillow was a crude arrangement of pine branches and flowers. "It was looking for Danny," Richard said quietly. "It wanted my son." I helped the Collins family financially to relocate to Aberdeen, where they stayed with relatives while looking for a new place. They never reported the incident officially. Who would believe them? A month later, they left Washington altogether, moving to California, where Sarah had family. I kept in touch with Richard for a few years. He was never the same. Jumpy, paranoid, wouldn't let his kids out of his sight. Eventually, we lost contact when he changed jobs and moved again. I've spent decades thinking about what happened. I've read up on Bigfoot sightings, even joined some research groups quietly. The details match many reports. The height, strength, red eye shine, the strange attraction to children that some witnesses report. But I never saw it myself, and part of me is grateful for that. The logging roads we cut through that area in the late 60s opened up much of that forest. Development followed, and the reports seemed to die down. But whenever I hear about missing hikers in the Pacific Northwest or strange noises in the woods, I think about Richard's story and the terror in his eyes as he told it. I don't go into the woods anymore. Some things you're better off not seeing. Whatever was out there, whatever destroyed the Collins home and tried to take their son, I hope it's gone. But deep down, I doubt it. Some nights I still wake up in a cold sweat, thinking about those 18-inch footprints and wondering what would have happened if that thing had gotten hold of little Danny Collins. Story 11. I haven't talked much about what happened to me back in September, partly because I know how it sounds, but it's been eating at me for months now. I need to get this off my chest, even if most people will think I'm crazy or just saw a bear. For context, I'm a park ranger in Washington State, have been for about 7 years now. I've spent more nights in these forests than most people ever will in their lifetime. I know the wildlife, I know the terrain, and most importantly, I know what belongs out there and what doesn't. What I saw that evening definitely didn't belong. It was the second week of September, just after Labor Day, when most of the summer crowds had thinned out. I'd taken a couple personal days to do some solo camping, something I do a few times a year when I need to reset. There's this spot I like along the coast, about 3 miles from any official campground, with these amazing rock formations that jut out into the water. Not many people know about it, which is exactly why I like it. I arrived around 2 in the afternoon, hiked in with my gear, and set up camp about 100 yards from the shoreline, tucked into a small clearing where I could still hear the waves, but had some protection from the wind. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, around 65 degrees, with just enough breeze to keep the mosquitoes away. I spent the afternoon just unwinding, reading a book, collecting some driftwood for a small fire later, taking photos of an osprey that was fishing nearby. Normal stuff. By early evening, I'd made dinner on my camp stove, just freeze-dried backpacker meal, nothing that would create much of a smell, and was feeling pretty content. Around 7:30, the sun was starting to set, and I decided to take one last walk along the beach before it got dark. I'd left my bigger flashlight at camp, but had my small headlamp in my pocket just in case. The tide was going out, and I was picking my way along the wet sand, looking at the different shells and rocks that had washed up. That's when I got that feeling. You know the one, when you suddenly realize you're being watched. At first, I ignored it. When you work in the wilderness, you get used to feeling eyes on you from time to time. Usually it's just a deer or raccoon curious about what you're doing. But this was different. The feeling was so intense that the hair on my arms stood up. I stopped and slowly scanned my surroundings. And that's when I saw it. About 30 yards ahead, partially concealed behind one of the larger rock formations, was a figure. And I mean large. At first, all I could make out was a silhouette because the sun was getting low behind it. But what struck me immediately was the size and proportions. This wasn't a person. Whatever it was, stood at least 7, maybe 8 feet tall, with shoulders that must have been twice as wide as mine. And I'm not a small guy. I'm 6'1", about 200 pounds. The head shape was all wrong too. It had this distinct slope to it, almost like it didn't have a neck at all, just shoulders that ran up into the head. The strangest part was how still it was, completely motionless, just watching me. I stood frozen too, partly out of shock and partly out of some instinctual fear response. We just stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only 20 or 30 seconds. Then it moved, not toward me, thankfully, but back behind the rock. It didn't scramble or rush, it just smoothly stepped backwards and disappeared from view. The movement was so controlled, so deliberate, nothing like how a bear or other animal would move. This was calculated. I remained where I was for a minute or two, straining to see if it would reappear. Part of me wanted to walk closer to investigate, but everything in my body was screaming to get back to camp. I'm not normally one to ignore my instincts, so I turned around and walked quickly back the way I came. By the time I reached my campsite, dusk had fully set in. I immediately started building up my fire, making it bigger than I normally would. I told myself I was just cold, but honestly, I wanted the light and the psychological comfort that comes with having a fire between you and the darkness. Every sound made me jump after that. A pine cone dropping onto my tent, waves crashing a little harder against the rocks, the wind shifting through the trees. I kept scanning the tree line with my flashlight, half expecting to see those same proportions emerging from the darkness. Around 10 o'clock, I heard something heavy moving through the underbrush, maybe 50 yards from my camp. Slow, deliberate footsteps that would pause occasionally. Not the random meandering of a deer or the quick scurrying of smaller creatures. Whatever it was circling my campsite, staying just beyond the reach of my firelight. I called out once, "Hello, is someone there?" Immediately regretting breaking the silence. My voice sounded thin and weak against the vastness of the forest. There was no response, except for the footsteps stopping momentarily before continuing their circuit around my camp. The noises continued intermittently for about 2 hours. I kept the fire blazing and sat with my back against a tree, knife in one hand, bear spray in the other, though deep down I knew neither would do much good if what I'd seen decided to approach. Around midnight, the sound stopped. Either whatever it was had left or it had settled somewhere to watch. Honestly, I don't know which possibility was worse. I didn't sleep. Not really. Maybe dozed off for 20-minute stretches. But then I'd jerk awake, convinced I'd heard something moving close by. The fire gradually died down, despite my efforts to keep it going, and by about 4 in the morning, I was sitting in near darkness, just the faint glow of embers providing any light. That's when I smelled it. I've dealt with all kinds of wilderness smells, dead animals, stagnant water, every type of scat you can imagine. This was different. It was a heavy, musky odor, like wet fur mixed with something vaguely sour. It wasn't overwhelming, just present, suddenly, as if carried on a change in the wind. I strained my eyes looking into the darkness, but couldn't see anything moving. The smell lingered for maybe 5 minutes, then dissipated as suddenly as it had appeared. By the time first light came around 5:30, I'd had enough. I started packing up my gear as quietly as possible, constantly glancing over my shoulder. My hands were shaking so badly I struggled with the tent poles. I kept dropping things, fumbling with zippers, making more noise than I wanted to. As I was rolling up my sleeping bag, I froze. At the edge of my clearing, maybe 20 yards away, was a distinct impression in the undergrowth where something large had been sitting or lying down. The ferns and small plants were completely flattened in an area about the size of a small couch. I abandoned any pretense of being quiet and just stuffed the rest of my gear haphazardly into my pack. I didn't even bother making sure my fire was completely out, though I did pour water on it. I'm still a ranger after all. I just needed to get out of there. The hike back to my truck was the longest 3 miles of my life. I felt exposed the entire time, like every step I took was being monitored. I kept looking back over my shoulder, convinced I would see that figure following me from a distance. The forest felt different, oppressive, unwelcoming. These were woods I'd walked hundreds of times before, but suddenly they felt alien. About halfway back to the trailhead, I heard a sound that still haunts me. From somewhere in the distance came what I can only describe as a long, deep vocalization. Not quite a howl, definitely not a scream, but something in between. It was far enough away that I couldn't pinpoint the direction, but close enough that I could tell it was powerful. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, then stopped. Nothing else followed it. I practically ran the rest of the way back to my truck. When I finally reached the parking area, there were a couple of day hikers just arriving, getting their gear together. They gave me odd looks, probably because I was sweating, wild-eyed, and looked like I hadn't slept all night. I just nodded at them and threw my pack in the back of my truck. As I was getting in, one of them called over, "Hey, good camping out there." I almost told them everything right then and there, but stopped myself. Instead, I just said, "Bit too isolated for my taste," and drove away. I haven't been back to that part of the park since. When colleagues ask why, I make up excuses about wanting to explore new areas. I haven't officially reported what happened either. In my position, claiming you saw what most people would call a Sasquatch is a good way to become the department joke. Or worse, have people question your mental stability. But I know what I saw. The proportions were all wrong for it to be human. The way it moved was too deliberate for it to be a bear. And whatever was circling my camp that night knew exactly what it was doing, staying just far enough away to remain unseen while letting me know I was being watched. The thing that gets me the most, the detail I keep coming back to, is how it was positioned when I first saw it. It wasn't just randomly there. It was strategically placed to observe me while remaining partially hidden. That speaks to intelligence, to purpose. It wanted to see me but didn't want to be fully seen itself. I've spent my entire career in these forests. I know every animal that's supposed to be out there, and I know how they behave. What I encountered was something else entirely. Something that doesn't appear in any wildlife guide or ranger training manual. I still work in the park, still do my job, but something fundamental has changed in how I feel in the wilderness. That absolute certainty I once had that I understood my surroundings is gone. Now when I'm out on patrol and get that feeling of being watched, I don't dismiss it so easily. Instead, I find myself scanning the tree line, looking for that distinctive silhouette and wondering if it's been watching us all along, just waiting for the right moment to be seen. Story 12. It was the second Saturday in November. Perfect weather for coon hunting. Cool but not freezing. around 45 degrees with a slight breeze that would carry scent well. Tyler and I had been planning this hunt for weeks, since our schedules rarely lined up these days. I work construction over in Springfield, while Tyler's got that job at the lumber mill that keeps him on weird shifts. We loaded up my old Ford F-150 around 4 in the afternoon. Our 4 dogs were beyond excited, jumping around in their kennels in the truck bed. We had Blue and Duke, our veterans, Blue being a coonhound mix we've had for 9 years, and Duke, a blue tick that's been with us since he was a pup, now 7 years old. Then there were the younger ones still learning the ropes. Sadie, a red-bone female just under 2 years, and Riggs, our walker that's still technically a pup at 9 months, but showing real promise. The spot we headed to was about an hour's drive from my place, deep in the Ozarks, where we've hunted probably 100 times before. It's remote. We're talking a 40-minute drive on Forest Service roads after you leave the asphalt. We've got permission from an old family friend who owns several hundred acres out there that backs up to thousands of acres of public land. Perfect raccoon territory with plenty of creek bottoms, hickories and oaks. We arrived just before dusk and parked at our usual spot, a small clearing near an old logging road. I remember checking my watch. It was 5:38 when we let the dogs out of their kennels. All 4 immediately started sniffing around, tails wagging, noses to the ground. Tyler slipped their tracking collars on, and I double-checked the handheld GPS to make sure all 4 were showing up. Technology's a godsend for coon hunting. Gone are the days when you'd lose a dog and spend half the night hollering for it. All set, I told Tyler as I slipped the GPS into my jacket pocket. Dogs are looking eager tonight. We grabbed our gear, headlamps, packs with water and some snacks, and our rifles. I had my Marlin 22, and Tyler carried his Ruger 10-22, standard coon hunting rifles, nothing fancy. We weren't expecting trouble of any kind, just the usual routine of following the dogs, maybe bagging a couple of raccoons, and heading home with some good stories. The first hour went exactly as planned. The dogs picked up a trail about 15 minutes in, and we followed the sound of their barking and the GPS tracker through the familiar terrain. Blue and Duke were leading as usual, with the younger dogs following their lead. We moved at a steady pace through the forest, our headlamps carving paths through the darkness. Around 7:15, the dogs treed their first coon of the night. Standard procedure. We caught up, shined our lights up the tree, spotted the raccoon, and Tyler made a clean shot. 1 raccoon in the bag, and the dogs were praised for their good work, especially Sadie, who was really starting to show promise. We continued deeper into the woods, following a creek bottom that narrowed into a ravine. The terrain was getting rougher, but nothing we hadn't navigated before. The dogs were about 100 yards ahead according to the GPS, moving steadily. Their barking was the normal, excited kind that told us they were on another trail. That's when everything changed. It was about 8:30 when the dogs' barking suddenly shifted. I've been hunting with dogs my entire life. My daddy put me in the woods with a hound when I was 6 years old, and I know every sound a hunting dog makes. This wasn't the excited, I'm on a trail bark, or the triumphant, I've got it treed bark. This was something I'd only heard a few times before. Pure alarm, fear, a warning. Tyler heard it too. "What the hell's got into them?" he asked, picking up his pace. The barking grew more frantic, higher pitched. Then Blue started howling, not the baying howl of a coon dog on a hot trail, but the mournful, scared howl of a dog in serious trouble. Duke joined in, and then I heard Sadie yelp sharply, like she'd been hurt or scared beyond belief. We started running toward them, our headlamps bobbing wildly, branches whipping at our faces. The GPS showed them bunched together about 80 yards ahead in a small clearing near the base of a ridge, and then, all at once, the barking stopped. Complete silence fell over the forest. No barking, no howling, nothing. Just our own heavy breathing as we pushed through the underbrush. "Blue! Duke!" Tyler called out, his voice echoing through the trees. No response. I pulled out the GPS, thinking maybe they'd moved on, but the screen showed all 4 dogs still in the same spot, not moving. We were about 50 yards away now. That's when we heard it, a sound I'll never forget as long as I live. Something massive was moving through the forest ahead of us, not the light pattering of raccoon feet or even the heavy steps of a deer. This was something crushing underbrush, snapping branches as thick as my wrist, moving with purpose. "Bear?" Tyler whispered, raising his rifle. I shook my head. We both knew it wasn't a bear. Bears make a particular kind of noise when they move. This was different, more deliberate, almost methodical. And it was heading away from where our dogs were supposed to be. We approached the clearing slowly now, rifles ready. Our headlamps cut through the darkness to reveal a scene that made no sense. The ground was torn up, leaves and dirt scattered everywhere, like there had been a serious struggle. Small saplings were broken off at chest height, but the dogs, all 4 dogs, were gone. "Blue, Duke, Sadie, Riggs!" we both called, our voices getting desperate. I checked the GPS again. According to the screen, all 4 dogs should have been right where we were standing. But there was nothing, no dogs, no collars, nothing. Just disturbed earth and broken vegetation. "This ain't right," Tyler muttered, shining his light in a wide arc around the clearing. "Something's very wrong here." That's when I spotted the first footprint. It was pressed into a patch of soft mud near the edge of the clearing, where the ground sloped toward the creek. At first I thought it might be from a bear standing on its hind legs, but one look told me it wasn't. The print was distinctly foot-shaped, 5 toes, a pronounced arch, a defined heel. But the size, Jesus, the size of it. It had to be 18 inches long and at least 8 inches wide at the ball of the foot, and it was deep, pressed a good 2 inches into the mud. "Tyler," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "look at this." He came over and I saw his face go pale in the glow of our headlamps. "What the hell made that?" he asked, but I think we both already knew. We just couldn't bring ourselves to say it out loud. We found a second print, then a third, leading away from the clearing toward the ridge. The stride length between them was enormous, at least 5 feet apart. Whatever made these was huge, heavy, and moved like a human on 2 legs. Against every instinct telling me to turn back, we decided to follow the tracks. Our dogs were missing, and as crazy as it sounds, we weren't about to abandon them. The tracks led up toward the ridge, becoming harder to spot as the ground grew rockier. We moved carefully, our headlamps sweeping back and forth, ears straining for any sound. The silence was what got to me the most. The forest should never be this quiet. No owls, no insects, nothing rustling in the underbrush. It was like every living thing was holding its breath. We traveled about 100 yards up the slope when Tyler grabbed my arm, stopping me in my tracks. He slowly raised his hand and pointed ahead. At first I didn't see anything. Then I noticed what had caught his attention. A dark shape standing between 2 large oak trees about 50 yards ahead of us, just at the edge of where our headlamps could reach. It was hard to make out details, but what I did see was enough to make my blood run cold. The figure was massive, far taller than any man I've ever seen. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe more, with broad shoulders and long arms. It was covered in what appeared to be dark, thick hair, but what struck me most was how it was standing, perfectly still, perfectly upright, like a human, watching us. For what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds, none of us moved. Not me, not Tyler, not the thing standing in the darkness. I could hear my brother's breathing beside me, shallow and fast. My own heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The creature shifted slightly, and that's when I realized we were downwind from it. It couldn't smell us, but it could see our lights. As if reading my thoughts, the figure suddenly turned, and with shocking silence for something so large, it disappeared into the dense forest. "Did you see that?" Tyler's voice was shaking. "Tell me you saw that." I nodded, unable to form words for a moment. We need to get the hell out of here, I finally managed to say. But the dogs are gone, Tyler. I cut him off. Whatever that thing is, it's got our dogs. We backed away slowly, not taking our eyes off the spot where the creature had vanished. Then, by unspoken agreement, we turned and moved as quickly as we dared back down the slope toward the clearing, and then toward our truck. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had us spinning around, expecting to see that massive shape bearing down on us. But nothing followed, at least nothing we could see or hear. The walk back to the truck felt like it took hours, though it couldn't have been more than 40 minutes. We moved fast, barely speaking, except to warn each other about obstacles in our path. When the truck finally came into view, we broke into a run, not stopping until we'd thrown ourselves inside and locked the doors. I started the engine with shaking hands, turned the truck around, and drove faster than was safe on those narrow forest roads. Neither of us spoke for a long time. "The GPS?" Tyler finally said as we hit the main highway. "Check the GPS again." I pulled it out, but I already knew what it would show. Nothing. No signal from any of our 4 dogs. It was like they had completely vanished from the face of the earth. We debated going to the sheriff, but quickly realized how it would sound. Our dogs disappeared, and we saw a giant, hairy man in the woods. We'd be laughed out of the station, or worse, suspected of being drunk or high while handling firearms. We went back the next day in broad daylight with 2 of our cousins. Found the clearing again, found some of the tracks, though they weren't as clear in the daylight. The others were skeptical until we showed them the broken saplings, snapped off clean at about 7 feet up, way too high for a bear standing on its hind legs. We searched for hours, but found no sign of the dogs. No collars, no blood, nothing. 3 months later, and I still wake up in a cold sweat, seeing that silhouette standing between the trees. Tyler and I have told only a few people, close family members who wouldn't think we were crazy. Most of them suggested bear, but we know what we saw. It was no bear. I've been hunting my whole life in those mountains. Never believed in any of that Bigfoot nonsense before. But I know what I saw, and I know something in those woods took our dogs. Something that walks on 2 legs, stands over 8 feet tall, and can move with unnatural silence through dense forest. I haven't been back to that spot since. Not sure I ever will. The hardest part is not knowing what happened to Blue, Duke, Sadie, and Riggs. They were good dogs, the best dogs. But whatever's out there in the Ozark Mountains, it's not something dogs or men should mess with. And it's still out there, watching and waiting in the deep woods. Story 13. I've been meaning to share this experience for a while now, but it's taken me months to process what happened. My hands still get shaky when I think about it. This happened last September when my family and my brother's family went camping in the Olympic National Forest in Washington State. I've been an outdoorsman all my life, grew up hunting with my dad, spent summers hiking, the whole 9 yards. My brother Jack is the same way. We wanted to give our kids the same love for the outdoors, so we planned this trip for months. My wife Sarah and our 2 kids, Emma 11 and Tyler 8, along with Jack, his wife Beth, and their kids, Madison 10 and Ethan 7, were all excited about a weekend away from screens and city noise. We arrived around 2 in the afternoon on Friday. The weather was perfect, not too cold yet, sunny, with that crisp fall feeling in the air. We had researched a spot that was about a mile off the main trail. It was close enough that we could get back to civilization if needed, but far enough to feel like we were actually experiencing nature. The hike-in was uneventful. The kids complained a bit about the weight of their small packs, but they were in good spirits. We found a nice clearing surrounded by massive pine trees and a small stream about 50 yards away. It was picture perfect. Exactly what we were looking for. By 4, we had both tents set up. One for my family, one for Jack's. Gathered firewood, and were settling in. I remember thinking how peaceful it was. The only sounds were birds, the distant stream, and wind through the trees. We cooked hot dogs and s'mores over the fire, told ghost stories, keeping them mild for the kids, and just enjoyed being away from the chaos of everyday life. As the sun started to set around 7:30, I noticed how quickly the forest changed. The light filtering through the trees created long shadows, and the sounds seemed to shift. It's normal, happens every time I'm in the woods at dusk, but something felt different this time. I couldn't put my finger on it. Around 8, we were still sitting around the campfire when I heard the first unusual sound, rustling from the edge of our campsite, maybe 30 yards away. Not the normal rustling of a squirrel or small animal. This was heavier, more deliberate. I glanced at Jack and he had heard it too. We both shrugged it off as probably a deer or maybe even an elk checking us out. Probably just curious wildlife, Jack said, poking at the fire. Sarah asked, "Should we be worried about bears?" "Nah," I assured her. "We stored the food properly, and the fire will keep most animals away." We continued our evening, but I noticed Jack kept looking toward where we'd heard the sound. I kept an eye out too, but whatever it was seemed to have moved on. By 10, the kids were exhausted, and it was definitely time for bed. We doused the fire properly, made sure everyone used the bathroom, we had a designated spot a short walk away, and got the kids settled in their sleeping bags. I remember zipping up our tent and hearing Jack doing the same, thinking that was the end of an almost perfect day. Around midnight, I know because I checked my watch when it started, I woke up to a distinct thud sound, followed by something being dragged across the ground. It wasn't loud enough to wake everyone, but it definitely wasn't a normal forest sound. I lay there perfectly still, listening intently. Then another thud, this time from a different direction. It sounded like something heavy being dropped or placed deliberately on the ground. Sarah stirred next to me but didn't wake up. The kids were out cold. I slowly sat up, trying not to make noise with my sleeping bag. That's when the first pine cone hit our tent. Not hard, just enough to make a soft thwack against the nylon. I froze. It could have been a coincidence, a pine cone falling from a tree, except there weren't any trees directly above our tent. We had specifically set up in a clear spot. Then another pine cone hit, this time from a completely different angle, and another. They weren't being thrown hard, not yet, but there was no way this was random. Something or someone was deliberately throwing pine cones at our tent. I was about to wake Sarah when I heard a sharp hiss from outside, the sound of someone trying to get attention quietly. It was Jack. I carefully unzipped just enough of the tent to peek out and saw his face illuminated dimly by the moonlight at his tent entrance. "You hearing this?" he whispered, his face serious. I nodded. "The pine cones? Something's throwing them from different spots." As we whispered, another pine cone hit his tent, this time with more force. Then one hit ours again from yet another direction entirely. "That's at least 3 different positions," Jack whispered, his voice tense. I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the night air. Whatever was out there was coordinating, positioning themselves around us. This wasn't random wildlife. This was intelligent and deliberate. We quietly agreed to stay in our tents and keep the families calm. If it was other campers messing with us, they'd eventually get bored and leave. If it was something else, well, we didn't want to provoke it by going outside. For the next 2 hours, pine cones continued to hit both tents from multiple directions. They started coming more frequently and with increasing force. One hit Jack's tent so hard the entire structure shook, and I heard Beth wake up with a startled gasp. Jack quickly calmed her down, but I could hear the strain in his whispered explanation. Sarah woke up during a particularly intense barrage around 2 in the morning. "What's happening?" she whispered, panic evident in her voice. "Something's throwing pine cones at the tents," I explained quietly, trying to sound calmer than I felt. Probably just some animal that's curious about us. But I didn't believe that. No animal I knew threw objects with such precision from multiple directions, with increasing intensity. This was something else entirely. The worst part was the silence between the throws. We couldn't hear anything moving out there, no footsteps, no breathing, nothing. Just the sudden thwack of another pine cone hitting the tent, sometimes followed by what sounded like soft, deep grunting from the darkness. Around 3 in the morning, one pine cone hit with such force that it actually tore a small hole in Jack's tent. I heard Madison wake up crying, and Ethan soon followed. The commotion woke up my kids too, and suddenly we had 4 terrified children and 2 frightened wives trying to make sense of what was happening. "Daddy, what's that noise?" Emma asked, clutching her sleeping bag up to her chin. "Just the wind blowing things around," I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Go back to sleep, sweetie." But then 3 pine cones hit our tent in rapid succession, making it impossible to maintain the lie. "That's not the wind," Tyler said, his voice small and scared. Sarah pulled both kids close to her. "It's okay," she whispered. "We're all together." The attacks continued, but strangely, they never escalated beyond the pine cones. Whatever was out there could have easily approached the tents, could have done worse, but they seemed content with this form of intimidation, letting us know they were there, that they had us surrounded, that this was their territory and we were unwelcome. I kept thinking about stories I'd heard over the years, stories I'd mostly dismissed as campfire tales, stories about the forests of Washington and the creatures some claimed lived there, Sasquatch, Bigfoot. I'd always been skeptical, but lying there in that tent, listening to those coordinated attacks from multiple positions, I couldn't think of any other explanation that made sense. Around 4:30, the attacks finally stopped. The forest fell eerily silent. No night birds, no insects, nothing. It was as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath. We stayed completely still, afraid that any movement or sound would trigger another barrage. By 5:30, with the faintest hint of dawn showing through the tent fabric, Jack hissed from his tent again. "Marcus, we need to get out of here, as soon as it's light enough." I agreed immediately. We waited until 6, when there was enough light to see clearly, before cautiously unzipping the tents. What we found outside confirmed everything. Dozens of pine cones scattered strategically around both tents. They weren't random. They formed almost a perfect circle around our campsite. Some were embedded in the dirt from the force of the throw. There were no footprints I could see, but the ground was hard and covered with pine needles in many spots. Jack and I exchanged a look that said everything. We didn't need to speak. We both knew what had happened, and we both knew we needed to get our families out of there immediately. "Why are there so many pine cones?" Madison asked, looking around with wide eyes. "Just fell from the trees overnight," Jack said casually, though his tight voice betrayed his fear. "Hey, how about we pack up early and go get pancakes in town for breakfast?" The kids, thankfully, were excited by this suggestion, and we used it as motivation to pack up in record time. No coffee, no breakfast, just rapid dismantling of the campsite. I noticed Jack had positioned himself between the forest edge and the kids the entire time, and I did the same on the opposite side. We were both scanning the tree line constantly, though neither of us saw anything. As we shouldered our packs and prepared to leave, I had the distinct feeling we were being watched, not just from one direction, but from all around us. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I fought the urge to run. We needed to leave calmly, without panicking the kids more than they already were. "Everyone stay together," I said, trying to sound like this was a normal hiking instruction and not a desperate plea. "Jack, you take point. I'll bring up the rear." We started back toward the main trail, moving at what I hoped was a casual pace. The mile back felt like 10. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had us all jumping. About halfway back, Tyler stopped suddenly. "Dad," he whispered, tugging my sleeve and pointing into the dense trees to our right. I followed his gaze but saw nothing at first. Then, just for a second, I caught a glimpse of something large, moving behind a thick trunk about 50 yards away. Something dark and massive that was not a bear or any animal I recognized. It moved with an odd fluidity, staying mostly hidden. "Come on, buddy," I said, gently pushing Tyler forward. "Let's catch up with the others." When we reached the main trail, the relief was palpable. Jack's shoulders finally relaxed a fraction, and the kids started chatting again. We made it to the parking area by 8:30, loaded everything into our SUVs, and drove straight to a diner in the nearest town. Over pancakes, Jack and I stepped outside while the wives watched the kids. "That wasn't bears," he said flatly. "No," I agreed. "Did you see anything on the hike out?" He nodded slowly. "Movement. Something big keeping pace with us just inside the tree line." Tyler saw something too, I admitted. "And those pine cones. Jack, they were throwing them from at least 3 different positions, coordinating." "I know." He ran a hand through his hair. "I did some reading a few years back after I met that guy who does the Sasquatch research. Throwing objects is apparently a known behavior. It's territorial." We stood in silence for a moment, both processing what had happened. "We don't tell the kids," Jack finally said, "or the wives, not the full truth anyway." I agreed. What would be the point? Who would believe us? We'd sound crazy. It's been 3 months now. I haven't been camping since, though I've found myself researching Sasquatch encounters in Washington state more than I'd like to admit. So many stories match elements of what we experienced. The coordinated movements, the territory marking, the intimidation tactics that stop short of direct confrontation. I still wake up sometimes hearing the sound of those pine cones hitting the tent, feeling that sense of being surrounded by something intelligent that was sending us a very clear message. You don't belong here. I don't know if I'll ever go back to those woods, but I do know that something was out there that night. Something that worked together, communicated, strategized, something that wanted us gone. And it succeeded. Sadari, Story 14. I never thought I'd be posting something like this, but I need to tell someone who won't immediately think I'm crazy. I'm not crazy. I know what I've seen. What's happening on my ranch is real. I've been a cattle rancher here in northern Arkansas for over 35 years. My place is pretty secluded, about 25 acres backing up to thousands of acres of dense forest. It's beautiful country out here, peaceful. At least it used to be. Everything started last spring. March was unusually cold, and we had one of those late-season cold snaps that can be rough on newborn calves. I'd been up half the night checking on a heifer that was calving, and by 4 a.m., she'd successfully delivered a healthy calf. I made sure they were both doing fine, then headed back to the house to catch a few hours of sleep before sunrise chores. When I went out at dawn to check on them, the calf was gone. Just gone. The mother was agitated, pacing and bellowing, but her baby had vanished. I searched that entire pasture for hours. No blood, no drag marks, no signs of coyotes or any other predator. The fence was intact except for one section that was strangely pushed down. Not cut, not jumped over, but pushed down like something incredibly strong had just walked through it. I figured maybe it was a mountain lion, though we haven't had many problems with them lately. I fixed the fence, chalked it up to bad luck, and moved on. Then it happened again 2 weeks later. Another calf gone without a trace. Then another in April. By this point, I started setting up trail cameras around the property. I'm not technologically inclined, but my nephew helped me set them up at strategic points where I'd had the problems. Meanwhile, other weird stuff started happening. I'd find my garbage cans completely destroyed, not just tipped over like raccoons might do, but the heavy-duty lids completely torn off and bent. One morning, I came out to find the metal door on my shop had a massive dent in it, like something had tried to punch through it. These weren't small dents. We're talking about a steel door with a fist-sized impression that pushed the metal in almost 4 inches. The trail cameras weren't much help at first. Most mornings I'd check them and find nothing unusual, just normal wildlife. But one camera kept getting moved, not like it fell, but like something deliberately repositioned it to point at the trees or the ground. Then I started getting weird images, just shadows and motion blurs. One night in late April, a camera caught what looked like eyeshine, but whatever it was stood at least 7 to 8 feet tall, based on where the eyes were positioned against the trees in the background. The next day, I found that camera smashed to pieces. By May, I was losing sleep. I'd hear sounds at night, strange sounds. At first, I thought it might be coyotes, but these were different. Deep, guttural noises, sometimes a long, mournful howl that made the hair on my neck stand up. Other times it sounded like whooping calls that would echo across my property between midnight and 3 in the morning. I've lived here my whole life. I know every animal sound in these woods. This was something I'd never heard before. In June, something started playing what felt like mind games. I'd wake up to find items moved around outside. Tools I'd left by the barn would be on my porch. A mineral block for the cattle that weighed over 50 pounds appeared on the hood of my truck one morning. It would have taken considerable strength to lift it up there. My cattle started acting strange too, bunching up in the center of the field instead of grazing normally, all of them facing outward like they were watching for something. July is when everything escalated. I found one of my full-grown heifers dead near the tree line. Her neck was broken, and she had deep lacerations across her flank. I called my vet, Ron, who's been working livestock around here for decades. He examined her and just shook his head. "Robert," he said, looking genuinely disturbed. "I can't explain what did this. These aren't coyote marks, not a bear, not a mountain lion. Whatever killed her broke her neck with one powerful twist. I've never seen anything like it." That same afternoon, I found the tracks by the creek. The ground was soft there from recent rain, and pressed into the mud were the clearest footprints I'd ever seen. Footprints that made my blood run cold. They were unmistakably foot-shaped, with 5 toes, but they were enormous, 17 inches long at least. They were deep too, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. I took photos. I even made plaster casts of them. I'm not some Bigfoot enthusiast. I've always laughed at those shows on TV. But standing there looking at those tracks, I couldn't deny what was right in front of me. By August, I was sleeping with my rifle next to my bed. The sounds at night were getting louder and more frequent. Sometimes I'd hear heavy footsteps on my porch, but when I'd turn on the lights and look outside, nothing would be there. Just the feeling of being watched from the darkness. September brought property damage. I came out one morning to find the door to my feed shed completely ripped off its hinges. Not just open, completely torn away and thrown 10 feet into the yard. The metal hinges were bent and twisted. Inside, bags of feed had been torn open and scattered everywhere. But what really got to me were the finger marks gouged into the wooden door frame. 5 distinct grooves pressed almost an inch deep into solid oak. Then I started finding tree branches broken. Not just any branches, but substantial limbs 8 feet off the ground, snapped and twisted in a way that couldn't happen naturally. Sometimes they were arranged in patterns that seemed deliberate, like something was marking territory. I tried calling the game warden, but when I started explaining what was happening, I could hear the skepticism in his voice. He suggested I might have teenagers trespassing, or maybe a black bear problem. He said he'd look into it, but nobody ever came out. By October, my neighbors started having problems too. The Wilsons, who live about 3 miles down the road, lost several sheep. Jim Carver, whose property backs up to the same forest as mine, started hearing the same howling noises at night. It was spreading, like whatever was out there had claimed the whole area as its territory. In November, I finally saw it. I was up early, just before dawn, checking on a section of fence that had been pushed down again. I had my binoculars with me, scanning the tree line as the first light broke over the hills. That's when I spotted it. It was standing perfectly still at the edge of the woods, partially hidden by a large oak. Even from that distance, I could tell it was massive, at least 8 feet tall, with impossibly broad shoulders and arms that hung down past its knees. It was covered in dark, matted hair, but its face... God, its face was the worst part. It wasn't an animal face, but it wasn't human either. Something in between that shouldn't exist. I stood frozen, binoculars shaking in my hands as it just watched me. It made no move to run or hide. If anything, it seemed to be studying me as much as I was studying it. Then, without any rush, it simply turned and walked into the forest, moving with an eerie smoothness that something that size shouldn't possess. I've tried everything since then. I reinforced my fences with heavy-duty cattle panels. I installed more lights around the property. I even tried leaving out food, deer meat and fruit, away from my buildings, hoping it might take that instead of my livestock. Sometimes the offerings would be taken, other times ignored completely. Nothing has worked. Just last week I found 2 more calves missing and another section of fence destroyed. This wasn't just pushed down. The metal posts were bent at 90-degree angles, like something had intentionally twisted them. My dogs won't even bark anymore. They used to alert me to anything unusual, but now they just whine and hide under the porch when night falls. It's like they've given up, or they know better than to challenge whatever's out there. I've documented everything. I have the photos of the tracks, the damaged property, the injuries to my livestock. I've recorded the sounds at night, those haunting howls and wood knocking that echo across the hills. I've kept a journal of every incident. Last night was the worst yet. Around 2 in the morning, something hit the side of my house with enough force to shake the entire structure. I grabbed my rifle and flashlight and looked out the window to see a shadowy figure moving across my yard toward the barn. It was walking upright but hunched over, moving with that same unnatural fluidity I'd seen before. I fired a warning shot into the air and the creature stopped. It turned toward the house, and I swear it stood up to its full height, towering in the darkness. For several seconds it just stared at me. Then it let out a roar that I felt in my chest more than heard, something between a bear's growl and a human's scream, but deeper and more powerful than either. Then it was gone, disappearing into the woods faster than something that size should be able to move. This morning I found my barn door completely torn off, 3 fence posts uprooted, and strange symbols carved into the side of my tractor. Deep grooves in the metal that looked like some kind of primitive language or warning. I don't know what to do anymore. The police think I'm crazy. Wildlife officials suggest it's just predators or vandals. No one believes what's really happening here. I know what this is. I know what's been terrorizing my ranch for almost a year now. It's the same creature people have reported seeing in these woods for generations. The same thing my grandfather used to tell stories about when I was a kid. Stories I never believed until now. It's a Sasquatch, a Bigfoot, and for whatever reason it's claimed my ranch as its territory. I'm not leaving. This land has been in my family for 4 generations, but I don't sleep much anymore. Every night I sit with my rifle, listening to those howls getting closer and closer. Sometimes I hear wood knocking from different directions, like there's more than one of them out there, communicating. I'm writing this because I need someone to know what's happening here. If something happens to me, at least there's a record. And if anyone else is experiencing this, you're not crazy. I believe you. Because right now, as I'm typing this, I can hear something moving on my roof. Heavy footsteps, too heavy to be anything normal. And there's that smell again, that strange, musky odor that fills the air whenever it's close. It's waiting, watching, testing me, and I don't think it's going to stop until it gets what it wants. Story 15. I still struggle to talk about what happened that day in the ravine, even after all these years. I've gone back and forth about whether to post this at all because, I know how it sounds, but I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone here has seen something similar. This happened back in 2004, when I was 16. I grew up in a small town near Brookfield, where everyone knew each other's business. Finding places to be alone was tough, which is why I treasured the ravine so much. It was this deep cut in the earth about 2 miles from my house, steep on both sides with a creek winding through the bottom. The locals called it Brody's Ravine after some farmer who owned the land generations ago. The ravine was my escape. My parents were going through a rough patch that spring, constant fighting that made being at home unbearable. My older brother had already moved out for college, so I was alone dealing with their arguments. Whenever things got too intense, I'd grab my backpack with a water bottle and some snacks and head to the ravine. That day started like any other Saturday in May. My parents had been arguing about money since breakfast, their voices carrying through the walls no matter where I tried to hide in the house. Around 11 in the morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I stuffed my backpack with a peanut butter sandwich, an apple, my water bottle, and a paperback I was reading for English class. I yelled something about going for a walk and slammed the door before either of them could object. The weather was perfect, around 70 degrees with a slight breeze, the kind of spring day that makes you feel like the whole world is waking up. I followed my usual path, cutting through old Mr. Hendricks's cow pasture. He never minded as long as I closed the gates, and into the woods beyond. The entrance to the ravine was hidden by a thick cluster of pines, which is why so few people ever went there. You had to know exactly where to turn off the main trail. From the rim, the ravine dropped about 60 feet to the creek below. I had a specific route I always took, a narrow, winding path that zigzagged down the slope. Parts of it were pretty steep, and I used the roots and smaller trees to steady myself as I made my way down. The creek wasn't particularly impressive, maybe 6 feet across at its widest, but it created this peaceful soundtrack of running water that would drown out my thoughts. I made it to the bottom around noon and decided to follow the creek upstream. This was my favorite section of the ravine. The water had carved out these small pools between the rocks, where tiny fish darted around in the clear water. The trees overhead created a dappled pattern of sunlight on the ground. I'd been walking for maybe half an hour, munching on my apple, and occasionally stopping to skip stones across the deeper pools. Around 1 o'clock, I reached a part of the ravine I called the clearing. It wasn't a proper clearing, more like a stretch where the trees thinned out enough to let more sunlight reach the ground. The creek bent sharply here, and the bank widened into a flat area covered with smooth stones and patchy grass. It was my favorite spot to sit and read or just watch the water flow by. I settled down on my usual rock, this flat boulder about the size of a coffee table that jutted out slightly over the water. I pulled out my sandwich and book and was just getting comfortable when I felt it. That's the only way I can describe it. A feeling, like when someone's staring at you from across a room and you can just sense their eyes on you before you even look up. At first, I ignored it. The ravine was isolated, but not completely. Sometimes other teenagers would come down to drink or make out. I figured it was probably just someone passing through, but the feeling didn't go away. It intensified, settling between my shoulder blades like a weight. The hair on my arms stood up, and a chill ran down my spine despite the warm day. I slowly closed my book and scanned the area around me. Nothing seemed out of place. The creek bubbled along as usual. Birds were still chirping, but something felt wrong. The atmosphere had changed somehow, becoming heavier. I can't explain it rationally, but it was like the ravine itself was holding its breath. That's when I noticed the silence. The birds had stopped chirping, no insects buzzing, just the sound of the water and my own breathing. I stood up, shoving my book into my backpack. My heart was pounding, though I couldn't pinpoint why exactly. I hadn't seen or heard anything concrete, just this overwhelming feeling of being watched. I thought maybe a bear had wandered into the ravine. It wasn't common, but not unheard of either. I started scanning the tree line more intently, looking for any sign of movement. Then I saw it. Across the creek, about halfway up the opposite slope of the ravine, something moved behind a cluster of maple trees. Just a slight shift, like something adjusting its position. If I hadn't been staring directly at that spot, I would have missed it. I froze. My entire body just locked in place. The movement happened again, and this time I caught a glimpse of dark fur between the tree trunks. My first thought was bear, but something wasn't right about the shape. It was too tall, too vertical. I held my breath and squinted, trying to make out more details through the foliage. The creature shifted again, and this time it moved partially out from behind the trees, and I saw it clearly. It was enormous. Standing upright on two legs, it towered over the surrounding vegetation, 7 feet tall at minimum, possibly 8. Its body was covered in dark brown fur, not black like I'd thought at first, but a deep, rich brown that almost looked reddish where the sunlight hit it. The fur was shaggy on its shoulders and shorter on its limbs. But it was the face that made my blood run cold. It wasn't a bear, not even close. The face was flat, almost human-like, with a pronounced brow that shadowed its eyes. And those eyes, large, dark, and unmistakably intelligent. They didn't have the predatory look of a bear or the vacant stare of a deer. They looked aware, calculating. The nose was flat with wide nostrils, no snout at all. Its mouth was closed, but the jaw seemed powerful, set in a grim line. I couldn't move. My muscles wouldn't respond. I just stood there, clutching the strap of my backpack so tightly my knuckles turned white. The creature hadn't seen me yet. It seemed focused on something on the ground. It knelt down, its movement fluid and deliberate. Not like an animal on all fours, but like a person crouching to examine something. Its arms were proportionally longer than a human's, ending in hands, not paws, with what looked like opposable thumbs. It brushed aside some leaves on the ground, picked something up, examined it, then placed it back down. The entire motion was so human-like, it sent another wave of chills through my body. Then it stood up again, rising to its full height, and my God, it was massive. The shoulders were incredibly broad, tapering down to a narrower waist. Powerful legs, slightly bent at the knee. It looked heavy, solid, not lanky like the Bigfoot drawings you see on cheap t-shirts. I knew I should run. Every instinct was screaming at me to get out of there. But I also knew that any sudden movement might draw its attention. And I was certain, absolutely certain, that I didn't want this thing to notice me. So I stood there, barely breathing, watching as it turned and began moving up the ravine away from me. Its gait was odd, not quite a human walk, but definitely bipedal. Each step was deliberate, careful. It moved with the confidence of something that knew this territory well. As it disappeared into the thicker trees further up the ravine, my body finally responded to my brain's commands. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on the spot where I'd last seen it. Only when I couldn't see it anymore did I turn and walk. Not run, walk, back the way I'd come. I was terrified that running would somehow attract its attention, like a predator's instinct to chase fleeing prey. Once I was around the bend and out of sight of the clearing, I picked up my pace. My heart was pounding in my ears, and I had to fight the urge to look over my shoulder every few seconds. The walk back felt 10 times longer than it had coming in. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made me jump. I climbed the path out of the ravine faster than I ever had before, occasionally using my hands to scramble up the steeper sections. Only when I reached the top, when the ravine was behind me and the open pasture lay ahead, did I finally break into a run. I sprinted all the way across Mr. Hendrix's field, not stopping until I reached the road. I didn't go straight home. I couldn't. My mind was racing, trying to process what I'd seen. I sat on the guardrail by the road for almost an hour, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear with mange. But bears don't have flat faces. A man in a costume, in the middle of nowhere, with no one around to prank. Nothing made sense. When I finally got home, my parents were still arguing. They barely noticed I'd been gone for hours. I went straight to my room and locked the door, sitting on my bed, staring at the wall until dinner time. I couldn't tell them. I couldn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? For the next week I avoided the ravine, but curiosity is a powerful thing, especially for a 16-year-old. The following Saturday, I went back. This time, I brought my brother's old digital camera, hoping to find some evidence. Footprints, fur caught on branches, anything. I was more cautious this time, moving quietly and stopping frequently to listen. When I reached the clearing, I searched the opposite bank where I'd seen the creature. Nothing. No footprints in the soft earth, no broken branches, no sign that anything unusual had passed through. I spent hours combing the area, working my way up the ravine in the direction it had gone. Nothing. I returned 3 more times over the next month, each visit yielding the same result. Absolutely no physical evidence of what I'd seen. Eventually, I convinced myself that maybe my eyes had played tricks on me. Maybe it was some combination of shadows and imagination, but deep down, I knew what I saw. The image of that creature is burned into my memory. Every detail, every movement. I didn't tell anyone about it until 3 years later when I was in college. My roommate and I were sharing weird experiences one night after a few beers, and it just came out. He laughed it off, of course, called me crazy, said I probably saw a bear and my teenage brain exaggerated it. I never brought it up again. I'm 28 now, and I've never gone back to Brookfield. My parents moved away after I left for college, so there's no reason to visit. Part of me wants to return to that ravine to see if it's still there, or if there's any sign of it. But another part of me is terrified of what I might find, or worse, what might find me. I've researched similar sightings since then. The physical description matches what people call Sasquatch or Bigfoot, but those names make it sound like some cartoon character. What I saw wasn't a myth or a legend. It was flesh and blood and terrifyingly real. The intelligence in those eyes wasn't animal-like. There was something almost knowing in the way it examined its surroundings. I still dream about it sometimes. In the dreams, it always notices me. It turns those dark, knowing eyes toward me and recognizes me as another intelligent being. Sometimes it approaches me. Sometimes it speaks, though I never remember what it says when I wake up. I don't know what I saw that day in Brookfield Ravine. I don't know if it was a known species or something science hasn't classified yet. All I know is that it existed, and it changed how I see the world. There are things out there in the woods, in the quiet places where people rarely go, that we can't explain. Things that watch us from the shadows, while we remain oblivious to their presence. And sometimes, if you're unlucky like me, you catch a glimpse of them. And once you do, you can never unsee it. You can never go back to believing the world is exactly as you were taught.